I am Kiara, 32. At my parents' lavish 40th anniversary dinner, my father raised his champagne flute and announced an all-expenses-paid trip to a five-star resort in Hawaii. Everyone cheered. When I calmly asked what time our flight was departing, he looked me dead in the eye and said I was not invited. He told me I was expected to stay behind and babysit my sister's children, while the real family enjoyed paradise. As the entire table erupted in mocking laughter, I did not shed a tear or raise my voice. Instead, I pulled out my phone under the table and permanently canceled the Black American Express card funding their extravagant life, a card they had no idea belonged to me. Before I share the rest of my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your toxic family exactly who holds the power. The evening began in the private dining room of the Oakpoint Country Club. Chandeliers cast a warm glow over the white linen tablecloths. For my parents, Marcus and Valerie, perception was everything. They spent their lives cultivating the image of the perfect affluent African-American family. They needed everyone to believe we were the epitome of generational wealth. Sitting across from me was my older sister Chloe, the undisputed golden child. Chloe was a public relations executive who spent more time curating her social media feed than working. Beside her sat her white husband, Preston. Preston carried himself with an unearned air of superiority, wearing expensive suits paid for by his father-in-law. To my parents, Chloe marrying a white man in finance was the ultimate status symbol. I sat quietly at the end of the table. I was the family disappointment. Years ago, I chose to leave my medical school program to pursue my passion for the hospitality industry. My parents were furious. They constantly referred to my career as a catering hobby. The waiter cleared our plates after a lavish four-course meal. My father, Marcus, stood up. He smoothed his tuxedo and tapped his fork against his glass to command the room. "I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate 40 years of marriage," my father began. "Your mother and I have built a legacy. To celebrate this milestone, I booked a 10-day all-expenses-paid trip to the Azure Point Resort in Maui for the entire family. We leave next Friday." Chloe shrieked with delight, throwing her arms around Preston. My mother, Valerie, beamed, adjusting her diamond necklace. I smiled politely. "That sounds wonderful, Dad. What time is our departure? I need to coordinate my work schedule." The celebratory atmosphere vanished instantly. The table went silent. My father looked down at me with cold disdain. "What do you mean our departure?" my father asked. "You are not going, Kiara. You do not know the flight details because you are not part of this trip." I kept my face perfectly neutral. "I am not invited to the anniversary trip." My mother let out a sharp sigh. "Oh, please do not start playing the victim tonight. Chloe and Preston have been working so hard and they need a proper vacation. You are just going to stay behind and take care of the kids. Since your cooking business hardly requires your full attention, it makes perfect sense for you to be useful for once." Preston leaned back, swirling his bourbon. "Do not take it personally, Kiara. You would not fit in at a luxury resort anyway. They have a strict dress code. Babysitting is a noble job, though. It suits you perfectly." Chloe laughed. "Seriously, Kiara, you would ruin the family photos with your cheap clothes. Someone has to watch the kids, and it is the least you can do to repay Mom and Dad for putting a roof over your head. Repay them." My mind flashed back to the day I turned 22. My parents completely drained my college savings account to pay for Chloe and Preston's extravagant wedding. They kicked me out of the house the following week, leaving me to build my life from scratch. They thought I was still that helpless broken girl barely scraping by. What they did not know was that my hobby had exploded over the past decade. I was now the founder and chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar luxury hospitality firm. I looked at my father, who was glaring at me as if waiting for me to cry. But tears were a luxury this family did not deserve from me. "I understand completely," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. "I hope you all have a truly unforgettable time in Hawaii." I reached into my designer clutch under the table and pulled out my phone. For the last 2 years, my parents had been living a lie. My father's construction business had quietly gone under. and his prestigious Black American Express card was drowning in debt. To prevent them from losing their country club membership, I had my financial team quietly absorb their debt. I issued a new corporate black card in my father's name linked directly to my personal wealth. He thought his business had miraculously bounced back. He had no idea his despised daughter was funding his steaks, his champagne, and his fake superiority. I navigated to the card management section. I found the exact card my father intended to use to pay for tonight's lavish anniversary dinner. With a gentle tap of my thumb, I selected Deactivate Card permanently. I slipped my phone back into my purse, took a slow sip of my sparkling water, and watched the dining room doors swing open. The head waiter was walking purposefully toward our table, carrying a black leather folio containing a bill for over $4,000. I smiled. The game was on. The heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room swung open, and the head waiter approached our table with quiet purpose. He carried a sleek black leather folio, the kind that held bills large enough to cover a mortgage payment. Before he even reached us, Preston leaned back in his chair, swirling the last drop of his bourbon, and fixed his pale eyes on me. Preston always had this way of looking at me as if I were a charity case that had wandered into his exclusive country club. He adjusted his silk tie, a gift my father had bought him last Christmas, and let out a condescending chuckle. "Do not take it personally, Kiara," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Hawaii is just not your scene. They have a strict dress code at the Azure Point Resort. It is not exactly the kind of place you can show up to wearing flour on your apron." Chloe chimed in, immediately twisting her diamond engagement ring. "Honestly, Kiara, Preston is right. You would feel completely out of place. The people who stay there are industry leaders, tech founders, and real estate moguls. You would just end up hiding in your room feeling insecure about your little catering business. Besides, someone needs to stay behind to manage the house and feed the dogs. It is the perfect job for you." I looked at my older sister, taking in her perfectly styled hair and her smug expression. She truly believed she had won at life simply because she married a white man who worked in finance. She had no idea that her perfect husband was currently wearing a suit paid for by my father, who was in turn being funded by the very sister they were currently mocking. I offered them a polite, empty smile. "You make a valid point, Chloe," I said softly. "I am sure I would be completely out of my element among all those successful moguls." The waiter finally reached the head of the table and placed the leather folio delicately next to my father. Marcus did not even glance at the total. He simply puffed out his chest, wanting to make sure the neighboring tables filled with Atlanta's elite doctors, judges, and politicians saw him playing the role of the generous patriarch. He reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out the heavy metal Black American Express card. The exact card I had deactivated from my phone less than 3 minutes ago. "Put it on the black card," my father announced loudly, making sure his voice carried over the soft jazz music playing in the background. "And add a 20% tip for your excellent service tonight. We are celebrating after all." The waiter offered a practiced, respectful nod, scooped up the folio, and walked away toward the billing station. My mother, Valerie, immediately leaned across the table, her eyes shining with pride. "Did you see the look on the Henderson family at the next table?" she whispered excitedly to Chloe. "They could not even afford the seafood tower tonight, and your father just paid for our entire $4,000 dinner without batting an eye. That is what true generational wealth looks like, girls. Take notes. Generational wealth." The phrase almost made me laugh out loud. The only wealth in this family was sitting quietly at the end of the table drinking sparkling water. My parents were drowning in debt, living month to month on a corporate card they assumed was a magical gift from a forgiving bank. I watched the second hand on my watch tick forward. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. The impending collision with reality was approaching fast. I saw the waiter returning, but his confident stride was gone. He looked nervous, clutching the leather folio tightly to his chest. He approached my father and leaned down, speaking in a hushed, discreet whisper. "Sir, I am terribly sorry, but your card has been declined." My father's confident posture vanished instantly. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. "What do you mean declined?" He snapped, his voice tight with panic. "That is a black card. There is no limit. Run it again. Your machine must be broken." "I ran it 3 times, sir," the waiter replied, keeping his voice as low as possible. "The system is showing that the account has been permanently restricted. Do you happen to have another form of payment?" Valerie gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. The neighboring tables were starting to notice the commotion. The Hendersons, who my mother had just been mocking, were openly staring. Marcus began patting his pockets frantically, sweat forming on his forehead. He pulled out a debit card, looked at it and shoved it back into his pocket. Knowing full well there was nothing in his checking account, Preston saw his opportunity to play the hero. He let out a loud, booming laugh. "It is just a bank security measure," Marcus Preston said confidently. "They lock those high-tier cards when you make large purchases out of nowhere. Do not even worry about it. I have got this covered." Preston reached into his wallet and pulled out a shiny platinum credit card. He handed it over with an arrogant flick of his wrist. "Put it on this, my good man," he ordered. The waiter took the platinum card and hurried away. I took a slow sip of my water, savoring the absolute silence. Exactly 2 minutes later, the waiter returned. He stood up straight, his patience completely gone, and placed the platinum card firmly on the table. "I am sorry, sir," the waiter announced, his voice ringing out clearly across the entire room. "But this card has also been declined for insufficient funds. The management requires immediate payment. Do any of you have a form of payment that actually works?" Chloe gasped in total shock as Preston turned completely pale and speechless. The silence that followed the waiter's announcement was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the opulent private dining room. The soft clinking of silver forks against fine china at the neighboring tables ceased entirely. Preston, usually so quick with a condescending remark or an arrogant chuckle, sat completely frozen with his mouth slightly open. His face, normally flushed with expensive bourbon, and unearned confidence drained to a sickly, chalky white. He stared at his rejected platinum card resting on the silver tray as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. My father Marcus clutched his linen napkin, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting toward the Hendersons, who were now openly whispering to each other behind their crystal wine glasses. The grand illusion of the mighty Wilson family, the untouchable pillars of Atlanta's elite society, was disintegrating in real time, exposed for the entire country club to see. The head waiter cleared his throat, completely unfazed by my family's public unraveling. He stood with the perfect, rigid posture of a man who had seen fake wealth collapse before and had zero patience for it. "I need to remind you that management requires settling the balance before you leave the premises," he stated, his voice devoid of any warmth or previous deference. "The total is $4,216. Panic finally broke through my mother's meticulously Botoxed composure. Valerie's eyes darted frantically across the table, skipping over my father's sweating face and Preston's paralyzed form until they locked onto me. The desperation in her expression instantly morphed into familiar, venomous entitlement. "Kiara," my mother hissed, leaning across the table so far her heavy diamond necklace clinked against her untouched dessert plate. "Stop sitting there like an idiot and do something. Give him your card right now." I slowly tilted my head, meeting her frantic gaze with absolute unshakable calm. "Give him my card," I repeated, making sure my voice carried just enough for the surrounding tables to hear every single syllable. "Yes, your card," she snapped, her voice rising in a panicked pitch that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Use whatever measly savings you have tucked away in that little bank account of yours. Empty your catering tip money if you have to. I do not care. Just pay this man so we can leave this place with some shred of dignity. You can consider it your gift to us for our 40th anniversary." Chloe suddenly found her voice slamming her perfectly manicured hands flat against the table. "Do it, Kiara. Stop being so incredibly selfish." Preston and Dad must have just hit their daily security limits because of how much they invest in the market. Pay the bill right now before you humiliate us any further in front of our friends. I looked at the four of them, taking a mental photograph of their desperation. My father sweating right through his tailored tuxedo, my mother practically vibrating with entitled rage. Preston staring at his lap in utter emasculated defeat. Chloe demanding I rescue them from a financial disaster of their own, making mere minutes after they had gleefully uninvited me from a family vacation and mocked my very existence. I reached into my designer clutch. My mother let out a loud dramatic sigh of relief, leaning back in her chair and waving a dismissive hand at the waiter. Finally, she muttered under her breath, "It is about time you made yourself useful to this family." I withdrew my hand from the clutch. I did not pull out a debit card. I did not pull out a credit card. Instead, I pulled out a crisp $50 bill, a 20 and a 10. I smoothed the cash out with deliberate, agonizing slowness and placed exactly $80 in the dead center of the white linen tablecloth. "What is this?" my father demanded, his voice cracking as he stared at the small pile of cash. "That is for my garden salad and my sparkling water," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and dangerously quiet. "I believe that accurately covers my portion of the evening, plus a generous 20% tip for the water refills." My mother slammed her fist on the table, no longer caring who heard her or how unhinged she looked. "Are you completely out of your mind? We are $4,000 short. You owe us this, Kiara. We put a roof over your head. We clothed you. We fed you for 18 years. You owe this family everything you have." I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. The harsh scraping sound echoed loudly against the hardwood floor, silencing the last remaining whispers in the dining room. I looked down at my mother, letting all the icy resolve I had built up over the past decade crystallize in my eyes. "I do not owe you a single dime," I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register that demanded absolute attention. "If we are calculating debts, Valerie, let us do the math right now in front of everyone. Let us talk about the $50,000 college fund my grandmother left exclusively for my medical school tuition. The exact same fund you and Dad secretly drained to zero, just so you could pay for Chloe's lavish wedding to a man whose credit cards apparently bounce at country clubs." Chloe gasped loudly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Preston flinched violently, as if I had physically struck him across the face, his head snapping up to look at my father in absolute shock. The murmurs from the neighboring tables suddenly swelled into loud, undeniable gossip. The Hendersons were definitely not missing a single word of this glorious exposure. "You stole my future to fund her fake fairy tale," I continued, pointing directly at Chloe's pale, horrified face. "You kicked me out the very next week with nothing but a single suitcase because I dared to confront you about the theft. I built my life with my own two hands, while you funded her extravagant lifestyle. So no, I will not be paying for your $4,000 steak dinner, and I certainly will not be funding your little Hawaiian vacation." My father stood up, his face a mottled shade of purple, with uncontrollable rage, pointing a violently shaking finger at me. "You sit down right now," he ordered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "You do not speak to your mother that way. You do not disrespect this family in public." I picked up my clutch and offered him a devastatingly polite, chilling smile. "Have a wonderful evening, Marcus. I highly recommend rolling up your tuxedo sleeves. I hear the industrial dishwashing liquid they use in the back kitchen is terribly harsh on the skin." I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, confident stride of a woman who completely owned her space. I glided past the bewildered country club manager, past the staring elite guests who parted for me like the Red Sea, and pushed through the heavy mahogany doors into the cool, crisp Atlanta night air. The valet rushed forward to retrieve my car, but before he could even hand his ticket to the attendant, my phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. It buzzed once, twice, 10 times in rapid succession. I unlocked the screen to a barrage of texts from Chloe. The messages were a frantic, chaotic mix of absolute desperation and familiar venom. "You ruined everything. Get back here right now and pay this bill. They are threatening to call the police on Dad. Preston is crying in the bathroom. I hate you. Come back. I read the messages with a satisfied smirk as the valet pulled my sleek chauffeur-driven Maybach up to the curb. I did not type a response. I simply blocked her number, slipped my phone back into my clutch, and climbed into the plush leather back seat, leaving my family stranded in the exact nightmare they had created for themselves. The heavy oak doors of the country club closed behind me, cutting off the frantic ambient noise of my family's impending ruin. The crisp Atlanta night air filled my lungs, carrying the faint scent of pine and impending rain. I descended the sweeping stone steps with a steady rhythm. At the base of the driveway, my driver David stood at perfect attention beside the gleaming black Maybach. He did not ask questions. He simply opened the rear door, offering a respectful nod as I slid into the cavernous, soundproof interior. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing me inside a world of absolute, untouchable peace. I poured myself a splash of sparkling water from the chilled console, letting the soft ambient lighting of the cabin wash over me as David expertly navigated the vehicle down the winding manicured driveway of the Oakpoint Country Club. For years I had maintained the illusion of the struggling caterer, the family disappointment who barely scraped by. It was the ultimate protective camouflage. They needed someone to look down upon to inflate their own fragile egos, and I needed them to leave me alone while I built my empire. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner of the secure tablet resting on the leather seat beside me. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the dark cabin. The dashboard displayed the interlocking corporate structure of my life's work. I was not a freelance event planner. I was the sole founder and chief executive officer of the Luminary Hospitality Group, a global conglomerate that owned a portfolio of five-star boutique resorts, elite dining establishments, and prime commercial real estate across 3 continents. My catering hobby had evolved into a multi-million-dollar behemoth. Through my subsidiary investment arm, Onyx Horizon Capital, I possessed more liquid assets than every single patron sitting in that country club combined. I tapped the screen, navigating past my quarterly earnings reports and global asset acquisitions, pulling up a highly encrypted private dossier. Wealth of my magnitude required ruthless risk management, which included running routine, exhaustive financial audits on my immediate family. I needed to ensure their reckless behavior would never create liabilities that could be traced back to me. Tonight, however, the audit felt different. Tonight, it was a weapon. I opened the file labeled with Preston's name, my brilliant finance bro brother-in-law, the man who had just spent the evening mocking my wardrobe and laughing at my expense. I pulled up the latest deep dive my forensic accountants had conducted on his so-called boutique investment firm. The truth was stark, pathetic, and entirely predictable. Preston was a fraud. A complete hollow shell of a man masquerading in bespoke Italian suits. According to the federal filings glowing on my screen, his investment firm had not just experienced a minor downturn. It had filed for bankruptcy exactly 2 years and 4 months ago. He had lost his clients' money, mismanaged his portfolio, and had his trading licenses quietly suspended, pending an ongoing investigation. He was utterly penniless. The platinum card he had thrown down on the table tonight with such arrogant flair was likely a secured card or maxed out to its absolute limit, held together by minimum payments and sheer delusion. He had been playing the wealthy white savior to my parents, soaking up their adoration while secretly drowning in a sea of defaulted loans and mounting legal fees. A sharp, humorless smile crossed my lips as I swiped to the next file. Chloe, my perfect golden child sister, who spent her days posting photos of luxury vacations and designer handbags, had absolutely no idea her husband was a financial corpse. She was living in a house of cards, blissfully unaware that the foundation had rotted away years ago. But the most sickening revelation was yet to come. I opened the joint financial dossier belonging to my parents Marcus and Valerie. I already knew my father's construction business had collapsed. I knew they were living beyond their means, but I needed to understand exactly where their remaining liquid assets had gone. My accountants had traced the wire transfers following the digital breadcrumbs of their vanishing retirement accounts. I stared at the glowing numbers, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The truth was worse than mere financial incompetence. It was a staggering pathological betrayal. My parents had not lost their retirement savings to bad investments or a failing business. They had voluntarily liquidated their entire life savings, taking massive early withdrawal penalties, and funneled every single penny into offshore accounts, controlled by Preston. They had taken out a second mortgage on the family estate. They had drained their emergency funds. They had quietly sold off my mother's inherited jewelry. They had systematically bankrupted themselves to bail out Preston and maintain the illusion of Chloe's flawless, affluent marriage. They had literally starved their own future to feed a parasite. Suddenly, another piece of the puzzle snapped into place. The lavish 10-day Hawaiian vacation my father had so proudly announced. If their personal accounts were completely drained, how had he secured a reservation at a 5-star resort in Maui? The answer was glaringly obvious. He had booked the entire extravagant package on the corporate black card, the very same American Express card I had just permanently deactivated. The resort deposits would bounce. The luxury flights would be canceled. The grand 40th anniversary celebration was nothing but a ghost funded by my invisible grace, which I had just swiftly and entirely revoked. I thought back to the dinner table. I thought of my mother demanding I use my measly savings to pay their bill. I thought of my father telling me I was not part of the family, telling me to stay behind and babysit while they enjoyed paradise. They were treating me like garbage, demanding I empty my pockets for them, while they had secretly handed millions to a man who mocked me to my face. They had sacrificed my college education for Chloe's wedding, and then sacrificed their own twilight years to fund Preston's lies. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was breathtaking. They were entirely broke, drowning in a nightmare of their own creation, completely reliant on a phantom credit card they had no idea I controlled. I locked the tablet and set it down, resting my head against the cool leather of the seat. The city lights of Atlanta blurred past the tinted windows. For 10 years I had harbored a small, foolish hope that one day my family might see me, that they might respect my hustle, apologize for stealing my future, and welcome me back to the table as an equal. Tonight had eradicated that hope entirely. They did not want a daughter. They wanted a scapegoat and an endless bank account. I had spent my entire adult life building an impenetrable fortress around myself. I had amassed power, wealth, and influence that they could not even begin to comprehend. They thought they had cast me out into the cold, but they had merely handed me the keys to the kingdom. My family was destitute. Their golden son-in-law was a bankrupt fraud, and their perfect daughter was living a lie. The facade was finally cracking, and I was holding the hammer. I closed my eyes, a sense of absolute, terrifying calm washing over me. I was no longer the wounded girl they had discarded. I was the architect of their impending reality. The country club bill was just the beginning. I held all the cards, and I was about to call their bluff. The next morning, sunlight struggled to push through the dusty, cracked blinds of my decoy apartment. The tiny one-bedroom flat was located in a notoriously run-down building on the far outskirts of Atlanta. The wallpaper in the narrow hallway was peeling in jagged strips, and the chipped laminate kitchen counters permanently smelled of old cooking grease. I kept this miserable little place for one very specific reason. It was my ultimate theatrical set. For years, I paid the meager rent in cash, maintaining a physical address that perfectly matched the narrative my family desperately wanted to believe. They needed me to be a struggling, impoverished event planner so they could feel superior about their own lives. If they had even the slightest inkling of my actual wealth, their financial parasitism would have been relentless. They would have bled me dry. So I gave them the illusion of my poverty. I stood in the center of the cramped, dingy kitchen, dressed in faded sweatpants and an oversized college shirt, sipping bitter drip coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. From a low angle, observing my calm posture against the backdrop of this manufactured squalor, my absolute dominance over the situation was undeniable. I was a predator waiting patiently in a very small cage. I knew they were coming. The desperate panic of sudden, undeniable poverty makes people incredibly predictable. The violent pounding on my thin wooden door started right at 8 in the morning. Before I could even turn the deadbolt all the way, Preston shoved his shoulder against the wood, forcing the door open with aggressive, uninvited force. He stumbled into my tiny living room, bringing with him the sour stench of stale alcohol, nervous sweat, and utter desperation. He was still wearing the exact same custom-tailored suit from the country club dinner, though it was now severely wrinkled, his expensive silk tie hanging loosely around his unbuttoned collar. Chloe barged in right behind him. The undisputed golden child looked completely unhinged. Her usually flawless blowout was flattened and messy, and dark circles of smudged mascara shadowed her eyes. They looked like royalty who had just been thrown out of their own castle. Chloe immediately pinched her nose, looking around my modest living room with an expression of intense disgust. "It smells like cheap cleaning supplies and desperation in here," she sneered, instantly trying to reclaim her position of superiority. "How can you actually live in this disgusting squalor, Kiara? You are an absolute embarrassment to the family name. We spent the entire night doing damage control because of your psychotic little stunt at the restaurant." Preston had to make a dozen phone calls to his international banking contacts just to clear up a simple fraud alert on his platinum card. The country club manager held us in the lobby for 3 hours like common criminals until Preston could wire the funds from an offshore holding account. I took another slow sip of my terrible coffee, keeping my face entirely blank. I knew for a fact that Preston did not wire a single dime from any offshore account. I had read his federal bankruptcy filings in the back of my Maybach the night before. His accounts were frozen, seized, and heavily monitored by the government. They had likely begged a distant relative or one of my father's remaining gullible friends for a quick cash loan just to escape the restaurant. Preston stepped directly into my personal space, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me in the small room. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. "You are going to fix what you broke, Kiara," he demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, threatening growl. "Because of the massive scene you caused, the country club management flagged your father's accounts. The luxury resort in Hawaii just notified us that the deposits for the anniversary trip bounced. The entire vacation is in jeopardy because you decided to throw a temper tantrum over a dinner bill." He leaned in closer, his breath hot and reeking of panic. "Here is what is going to happen. You are going to march down to your little local bank branch the second they open. You are going to take out a $50,000 personal loan. You will wire that cash directly into my account by noon today. I will handle the capital allocation and ensure the resort reservations are secured. You owe this family for ruining your parents' 40th anniversary. Consider this debt consolidation. You leverage your credit, and I save the family reputation." I stared at him, marveling at the sheer audacity of his delusion. He was completely bankrupt, facing potential federal indictment, and yet he was standing in my decoy apartment demanding I take out a predatory personal loan to fund his tropical vacation. I did not blink. I did not step back. I simply looked him dead in the eye and spoke with absolute unwavering clarity. "I am not taking out a loan to fund a luxury vacation for parasites who openly despise me. You can pay for your own flights, Preston. Assuming, of course, your platinum card ever recovers from that mysterious fraud alert." Chloe let out a high-pitched scream of frustration. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone, holding it up like a loaded weapon. "You want to play hardball, Kiara?" She threatened, her voice shaking with vicious intent. "You think you can just walk away from us? I am a public relations executive. I hold the keys to this entire city. I have a network of top-tier influencers, elite bloggers, and media contacts. By the time I am finished typing, your pathetic little catering business will be completely annihilated. I will post hundreds of fake one-star reviews on every platform. I will invent horror stories about food poisoning. I will call the health inspector and have them raid whatever cheap commercial kitchen you rent. I will make absolutely sure you never cater another event in Atlanta for the rest of your miserable life. You will be ruined by tomorrow morning." For a long moment, the tiny apartment was dead silent. Preston crossed his arms, looking smug, clearly believing Chloe had just delivered the ultimate checkmate. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to fall to my knees, beg for forgiveness, and immediately agree to their insane financial demands to save my meager livelihood. Instead, I tilted my head back and laughed. It was not a nervous laugh. It was a rich, genuine booming sound that echoed off the thin, peeling walls of the decoy apartment. I laughed from the bottom of my chest, completely unrestrained. The sound was so jarring, so entirely devoid of fear, that Preston physically took a step back, his false bravado shattering instantly. Chloe lowered her phone, her eyes wide with total confusion and rising panic. My laughter was the sound of a predator watching its prey happily walk directly into a steel trap. I looked at Chloe, wiping a tear of pure amusement from the corner of my eye. "Do it!" I challenged her, a chilling smile spreading across my face. "Type the reviews right now, Chloe. Call the health inspector. Destroy my catering business. I strongly encourage you to dig your own grave as deep as you possibly can." I turned my back on them and walked to the kitchen sink, rinsing out my coffee mug with total indifference. They stood frozen in my living room, deeply unsettled by my absolute lack of fear. They came to ambush a struggling sister, but they were beginning to realize with a creeping sense of dread that they were threatening a phantom. They had no idea they were standing in the presence of a centimillionaire who was already orchestrating their absolute destruction. Camera action dolly in close on Kiara's face as a sly smile spreads across her lips. My laughter faded into a sharp, ringing silence that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the cramped living room. I leaned back against the chipped laminate of the kitchen counter, crossing my arms loosely across my chest. I did not blink. I simply watched them. The absolute absence of fear in my posture struck a discordant chord in the room. Chloe lowered her smartphone, her perfectly manicured thumb hovering uncertainly over the screen. She looked at me as if I had suddenly sprouted a second head. She was waiting for the panic, the tears, the desperate begging that usually followed her threats. When none came, she glanced nervously at her husband. Preston stepped forward, his leather dress shoes squeaking slightly on the cheap linoleum floor. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his height and his impeccably tailored, though severely wrinkled suit to physically dominate the small space. His face flushed with a dark, ugly crimson. He could not comprehend a world where a woman living in a neighborhood like this dared to laugh at him. "You think this is a joke?" Kiara Preston growled, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "This is exactly why you will always be the failure of this family. You have zero business acumen, zero drive, and zero respect for the people who actually know how the world works. You cater cheap weddings for pennies while your parents rely on me to manage their wealth. Frankly, you are the ultimate underachiever of the Black community. You squander every opportunity handed to you, unlike my brilliant wife who actually understands how to build a legacy and command respect in elite circles." I stared at him, letting his racial microaggressions and breathtaking arrogance hang in the stale air. For years, Preston had played the role of the benevolent white savior, gracing our family with his supposed financial genius, treating me like an uneducated charity case who needed his constant guidance. He truly believed his own fabricated mythology. "Let us talk about your brilliant legacy, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerously calm whisper. I pushed off the counter and walked slowly toward the battered wooden table in the corner of the room. Sitting entirely out of place amidst the peeling wallpaper and thrift store furniture was my sleek top-tier laptop. I flipped the screen open. The device bypassed the lock screen, instantly recognizing my face. I did not need to access my highly encrypted private corporate dossiers to destroy him right now. I just needed the public records. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision. "Come here," I commanded, not looking up from the screen. Preston scoffed, crossing his arms tightly. "I am not playing your stupid games, Kiara. You are going to transfer those funds right now, or I am calling the bank to initiate a hard inquiry on your accounts." I turned the laptop around so the high-definition screen faced him directly. "I highly doubt you want to initiate a hard inquiry on anyone right now, Preston. Not with a public record that looks like this. Step forward and read it. Or should I read it out loud for my brilliant sister to hear?" Preston rolled his eyes, marching over to the table with an exasperated sigh. He leaned down, preparing to deliver another condescending lecture. His pale eyes hit the glowing screen. I watched the exact millisecond his soul left his body. The crimson flesh vanished from his face, replaced by a sickly, translucent gray. His jaw went entirely slack. His hands, previously balled into aggressive fists at his sides, began to tremble uncontrollably. He was staring directly at the United States Federal Public Financial Registry. The screen clearly displayed the legal status of his supposedly elite investment firm. Bankrupt. Right beneath that glaring red status marker was a detailed list of his defaulted personal loans stretching back over 24 months. And at the very bottom of the page, highlighted in bold black text, was the crown jewel of his financial ruin. A massive active IRS tax lien filed against him for unpaid federal taxes, totaling nearly $2 million. "What is she showing you, babe?" Chloe asked, her voice tinged with sudden, genuine confusion. She took a step toward the table, her high heels clicking on the floor. "Is she in debt? Did she file for bankruptcy?" "I knew her catering business was a complete failure. Let me see it." Preston reacted with the sheer blind panic of a trapped animal. He lunged forward, slamming the laptop shut with a violent echoing crack before Chloe could get within 5 feet of the screen. He spun around to face her, spreading his arms wide to physically block the table. "It is nothing, Chloe." Preston stammered, his voice suddenly a full octave higher. He was sweating profusely now, beads of moisture gathering on his forehead. "It is just some fake paperwork. She is just trying to distract us with some fabricated internet nonsense. It means absolutely nothing. Do not even look at it." Chloe stopped, frowning at her husband's frantic, erratic behavior. "But why are you sweating? What did she show you?" I leaned against the table, offering Preston a cold, terrifying smile. "Yes, Preston, tell your brilliant wife what fake paperwork I just showed you. Explain to her exactly why the deposits for the Hawaiian anniversary trip bounced. Tell her why you are standing in a rundown apartment in the worst part of Atlanta, begging a caterer for a $50,000 personal loan." "Shut your mouth!" Preston hissed at me, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He was silently begging me. The arrogant, wealthy savior was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, broken fraud who knew his entire life was seconds away from imploding. I looked at Chloe, who was now staring at her husband with dawning suspicion. I could end it right here. I could tell her that the designer bags she carried were funded by our parents' drained retirement accounts. I could tell her that her husband was a criminal facing federal tax evasion charges. But that would be too easy. That would be a mercy they did not deserve. I wanted them to sweat. I wanted the paranoia to slowly eat them alive. "Do not worry, Chloe," I said smoothly, picking up the closed laptop and sliding it under my arm. "Your husband is absolutely right. It is just some boring financial data. I am sure his portfolio is completely secure." I turned my gaze back to Preston, locking eyes with him. I saw the sheer, unadulterated relief wash over his pale, sweating face. He thought he had survived. "I will keep your dirty little secret, Preston," I whispered softly, ensuring only he could hear the fatal promise in my voice. "I will keep it entirely to myself, for now." His relief vanished, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. He knew exactly what I was doing. I was holding the blade directly over his neck, and I would let it drop precisely when it would inflict the maximum amount of collateral damage. "Now," I said, raising my voice to a sharp, commanding tone that left absolutely no room for debate. "Both of you need to get out of my house. Right now, you are trespassing and you are breathing my oxygen." Chloe opened her mouth to argue, her familiar entitlement flaring up again, but Preston grabbed her arm with bruising force. "We are leaving," he ordered, his voice cracking. He practically dragged my bewildered sister toward the front door. "But my reviews," Chloe protested, stumbling as Preston pulled her along. "The catering business, we have to make her pay." "Leave it alone, Chloe," Preston snapped, ripping the front door open. "Just leave it alone." They stumbled out into the dingy hallway. I walked forward and slammed the door shut behind them, locking the deadbolt with a resounding click. The decoy apartment fell silent once more. I walked over to the cracked window and peered through the blinds, watching Preston practically shove his wife into the passenger seat of their leased luxury car before speeding out of the cracked parking lot. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. They thought they were in control. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They had absolutely no idea that the real war had not even started yet, and I was already the only one left standing on the battlefield. Camera action. Slow pan across the room, stopping as Kiara sits back down, crossing her arms. Less than 24 hours after kicking Preston and Chloe out of my decoy apartment, a sterile formal text message arrived on my phone. It was from my father demanding my immediate presence at the family estate in Buckhead. I knew exactly what this was. This was the Empire striking back. I selected a remarkably unremarkable beige sweater and faded jeans, playing the role of the impoverished outcast to absolute perfection, and drove my discreet hybrid rental car to the sprawling gated property. The wrought iron gates swung open, revealing the massive brick manor that had served as the physical monument to my parents' ego for over 2 decades. The perfectly manicured lawns, the imported Italian marble fountain in the circular driveway, the towering columns flanking the heavy double doors. It was all a glorious, suffocating illusion. It was a museum of wealth currently being held together by chewing gum delusion and a deactivated American Express black card. I walked through the grand foyer, my footsteps echoing against the vaulted ceilings, and entered the formal living room. My entire family was already assembled, waiting for me in a tight, judgmental semicircle. My father, Marcus, stood by the massive stone fireplace, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. My mother, Valerie, sat stiffly on the tufted velvet sofa, her posture rigid with righteous indignation. Chloe and Preston sat in the matching armchairs across from her. Preston looked physically ill, his skin a splotchy, sickly gray. He kept his eyes glued to the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, absolutely refusing to make eye contact with me. He knew I held his financial death warrant, but he clearly had not breathed a single word of his bankruptcy to my parents or his wife. He was going to sit there and let them walk blindly into a slaughter. "Take a seat, Kiara," my mother ordered, gesturing to a lone, hard-backed wooden chair positioned in the dead center of the room. It was staged perfectly, designed to make me feel small, isolated, and surrounded by my superiors. I walked over to the chair, but I did not cower. I sat down with slow, deliberate precision. I leaned back against the hardwood, crossing my arms over my chest, and fixed my gaze directly on my mother. "We have called you here today because we are staging a formal intervention," Valerie announced, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "We love you, Kiara, but your behavior over the past 48 hours has escalated from merely embarrassing to completely unhinged. You are clearly suffering from a severe mental breakdown, and your actions are actively destroying this family." My father took a sip of his scotch, the ice clinking loudly in the tense silence. "You sabotaged our 40th anniversary trip out of pure malicious spite," Marcus stated, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "The country club manager called me this morning. He informed me that the card on file for our monthly dues was abruptly restricted. When I contacted the Hawaiian resort to confirm our luxury suites, they told me the deposit had bounced. You embarrassed us in front of the entire Atlanta elite last night, and then you somehow managed to flag our accounts with your psychotic little temper tantrum." I stared at him, marveling at the sheer depth of his denial. He actually believed that my refusal to pay a dinner bill had triggered a massive fraud alert across his entire financial portfolio. He could not fathom that he was simply out of money. He could not comprehend that the magic well had run dry because the invisible benefactor had finally turned off the tap. "You have been a bitter, resentful disappointment since the day you turned 18. My father continued, beginning to pace across the length of the Persian rug. "You are exactly like your disgraced Aunt Beatrice. She turned her back on our family's social standing, married a nobody, and died completely destitute. You started down this exact same pathetic path the minute you refused to pledge our family's legacy sorority. Your mother and your grandmother were esteemed members of that chapter." Chloe wore the letters with pride. "But you You threw away a century of carefully cultivated social tradition because you thought you were too good for it. You threw away your elite lineage to bake appetizers for local nobodies in a rented commercial kitchen. Chloe leaned forward, her eyes flashing with venomous triumph. You are just intensely jealous of my perfect life, Kiara. That is what this intervention is really about. You are 30 years old, single, and scraping the bottom of the barrel. You look at me, and you see everything you desperately want, but will never have. You see my flawless marriage to a brilliant, successful financier. You see our beautiful home, our luxury cars, and our elite social circle. Your jealousy is literally driving you insane, and now you are lashing out and trying to ruin our happiness because your own life is a miserable, empty failure. I glanced at Preston. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He opened his mouth as if to speak to stop his wife from digging their grave any deeper, but fear kept him entirely paralyzed. He remained silent, a coward to his very core. My mother reached onto the glass coffee table and picked up a thick manila envelope. She pulled out a stack of printed spreadsheets and dropped them forcefully onto the glass. We have spent the entire morning calculating the exact financial damages of your little stunt, Valerie declared, her voice sharp and uncompromising. Between the non-refundable Hawaiian resort fees, the first-class flight cancellation penalties, and the country club embarrassment tax, you have cost this family exactly $42,500. She leaned forward, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. You are going to compensate us for this loss immediately. Since we all know your bank accounts are practically empty, we have drawn up the necessary legal paperwork. You are going to sign over the title to your catering delivery vehicle to Preston. He will liquidate it through his firm to recoup a fraction of the costs. Furthermore, you will transfer every single dollar from your personal savings account into your father's checking account before you leave this house today. It is the absolute least you can do to begin repairing the massive damage you have inflicted on us. I sat perfectly still, letting their demands hang in the heavy, silent air of the grand living room. They wanted me to sign over a vehicle that did not exist and empty a decoy bank account holding exactly $400, all to compensate them for a luxury vacation they could not afford, because they had given all their money to the bankrupt fraud sitting right next to them. The psychological projection was a masterpiece of human delusion. They were completely broke, bleeding out from 1,000 self-inflicted financial wounds, and yet they sat on their velvet throne, demanding that I sacrifice my flesh to keep them alive. I did not yell, I did not cry, I did not defend my catering business or my life choices. I simply sat there observing them with the detached clinical fascination of a scientist examining a dying parasitic organism under a microscope. I was fully prepared to let them play their entire hand before I burned their castle to the ground. I let the silence stretch until it became a physical weight in the room, pressing down on their shoulders while I breathed easily. Valerie pushed the manila envelope closer to me across the glass coffee table, the sharp sliding sound cutting through the quiet. She tapped the top of the printed contract with a manicured fingernail, expecting me to pick up the pen resting beside it. Instead, I leaned forward, picked up the pen, and calmly tossed it over my shoulder. It bounced off a decorative marble vase and clattered uselessly onto the hardwood floor. I will not be signing a single piece of paper, I said, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. I will not be transferring my savings, and I will certainly not be handing over the title to my vehicle so Preston can pretend he actually generates revenue. If you are $42,000 in the hole for a vacation, you clearly had no business booking in the first place. I suggest you ask your brilliant son-in-law to liquidate some of his imaginary assets to cover it. Chloe shot up from her armchair, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure outrage. How dare you speak to my husband that way? Preston is a financial visionary. He manages portfolios you could not even dream of understanding. You are just a bitter, lonely caterer who wants to drag everyone down to your miserable level. Preston remained entirely silent, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows just waiting for the lever to be pulled. He knew exactly why I was refusing, and he knew that if Chloe kept pushing, I might just hand her the literal receipts of his $2 million tax lien right then and there. My father, however, did not share Preston's terrified self-preservation. Marcus slammed his crystal tumbler down onto the mantel of the stone fireplace with enough force to threaten the glass. "Fine," he roared, his voice booming through the vaulted ceiling of the grand living room. "Keep your pathetic, miserable little pennies. Keep your delivery van and your petty cash. We do not need a single dime from you, Kiara. We never did. This intervention was about giving you a chance to make amends and act like a part of this family. But clearly you are completely beyond saving." He began to pace again, his chest puffing out with that familiar toxic arrogance that had dictated my entire childhood. "You think we are hurting financially because of your petty little temper tantrum at the country club? You think canceling a vacation ruins us? You are incredibly naive. I am Marcus Wilson. I do not rely on caterers for capital. In fact, I just secured our family's legacy for the next 5 generations, and you will not see a single cent of the profits." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely curious about the specific flavor of delusion my father was currently serving. "Do tell, Marcus. How exactly did you secure this monumental legacy while your credit cards are bouncing at local steakhouses?" My mother smiled, a smug, triumphant expression that made my stomach turn. "Your father just finalized a massive second mortgage on this entire estate," she announced proudly. "We pulled out $3 million in pure equity, and we did not use some common retail bank either. Preston used his elite industry connections to secure the funding through an exclusive ultra-private commercial lending firm." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. A second mortgage on the family estate for $3 million. My eyes slowly tracked over to Preston. His face was no longer pale. It was completely ashen. He was trembling so violently that his knees were shaking against the fabric of his trousers. He had actually done it. He had convinced my arrogant, financially illiterate parents to mortgage their fully paid-off multi-million-dollar home just to put liquid cash directly into his desperate, bankrupt hands. "And what exactly are you doing with $3 million of high-interest debt at your age?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain completely steady while my mind raced through the terrifying implications of their sheer stupidity. "We are acting as the sole angel investors for Preston's new venture," my father declared, gesturing grandly toward his son-in-law. "Preston is launching a revolutionary financial technology startup. It is going to completely disrupt the automated trading market. He gave us the exclusive opportunity to get in on the ground floor before he takes the company public. We leveraged the house to provide the seed capital, and in less than 2 years, that $3 million will turn into $30 million. Preston guaranteed it." A tech startup. Preston could barely manage his own fraudulent tax returns, let alone code a disruptive fintech platform. He had swindled my parents out of their home to pay off the IRS and keep himself out of federal prison. It was a grift so spectacular, so breathtakingly malicious, that I almost had to admire the sheer sociopathy of it. But the final piece of the puzzle had not yet fallen into place. "You must be very proud," I said smoothly. "It takes a very specific kind of private lender to approve a $3 million cash-out refinance on a residential estate with no verified income streams." "What was the name of this elite institution Preston found for you?" Preston jerked his head up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since I arrived. His gaze was pleading, a silent, desperate scream begging me not to ask, begging my father not to answer. "It is an incredibly exclusive firm out of New York," my father said, puffing out his chest with unearned pride. "You have probably never heard of them. They only deal with high-net-worth individuals and institutional wealth. They are called Onyx Horizon Capital." The name hung in the air. Onyx Horizon Capital. A tight, dangerous thrill shot straight up my spine, settling into a cold, heavy block of absolute power in my chest. I did not gasp. I did not widen my eyes. I simply let a slow, terrifyingly serene smile spread across my lips. Onyx Horizon Capital was not an exclusive firm out of New York. It was a subsidiary holding company registered in Delaware. It was the commercial lending arm of the Luminary Hospitality Group. It was my company. I sat there looking at my father, who was standing in the middle of a house he no longer truly owned. I looked at my mother, who was sitting on a sofa she had effectively pawned to a phantom. I looked at Preston, who had brokered the destruction of my family's estate through an automated online commercial lending portal, entirely unaware of who sat at the very top of that corporate ladder. My acquisitions team processed dozens of high-risk, high-yield private mortgages a month. They bundled them, assessed the collateral, and approved them without ever needing my direct signature for anything under $5 million. Preston had sought out a shadow corporation willing to overlook my parents' lack of income in exchange for predatory interest rates and the deed to a massive estate in Buckhead. He had blindly walked into the open jaws of my own financial empire. My father had not just taken out a loan, he had unwittingly signed the deed of his beloved ancestral home directly over to the daughter he had just called a bitter, resentful disappointment. Onyx Horizon Capital. I repeated softly, letting the syllables roll off my tongue like fine wine. That sounds like a very serious institution, Marcus. I imagine their default penalties are incredibly unforgiving. They are professionals. My father scoffed, completely oblivious to the lethal trap closing around his throat. We will not be defaulting. Preston's startup launches next quarter. We will pay off the loan in full and own 70% of a billion-dollar tech firm. You are just upset because you will be standing on the outside looking in. I stood up from the hard wooden chair. I did not feel small anymore. I felt like a titan. I looked around the grand living room, taking in the crystal chandeliers, the imported art, the towering windows. It was a beautiful house. It would make an excellent corporate retreat for my executive team once I foreclosed on it. You are absolutely right, Marcus, I said, my voice echoing with quiet, absolute finality. I am completely on the outside of your little arrangement. I will not be giving you a single penny today, and I will not be returning to this house until there is a fundamental change in management. I picked up my purse and looked directly at Preston. His eyes were wide, panicked pools of sweat and terror. Make sure you read the fine print on that Onyx Horizon contract, Preston, I whispered. I hear their CEO is absolutely ruthless when it comes to collecting debts. Camera action. Dolly in, slowly magnifying the intensity of Kiara's words. I let the name of the lending firm hang in the heavy, stagnant air of the grand living room, watching my father puff out his chest with ignorant, unearned pride. I turned my attention back to him, my expression hardening into something entirely unreadable. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the cold, hard facts bleed into the space between us. Onyx Horizon Capital is not just an exclusive lending firm out of New York. Marcus, I stated, my tone dropping to a low conversational timbre that carried effortlessly across the expansive room. They are infamous in the commercial financial sector for highly aggressive predatory asset seizure. They specifically target over-leveraged, desperate borrowers who are willing to sign away their primary assets for quick liquid cash. They secure exorbitant interest rates, and the absolute second a single payment deadline is missed, they execute irreversible foreclosure tactics. They do not negotiate. They do not grant grace periods or extensions to save face. They acquire the collateral, lock the original owners out of the property, and liquidate it immediately. You did not just secure a loan, Father. You just blindly handed the deed to your beloved family estate directly over to a corporate butcher. My father's arrogant, smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A brief, sudden flash of deep uncertainty crossed his eyes before his towering ego violently reasserted control. He opened his mouth to argue, but my mother beat him to it. Valerie slammed her hand down onto the armrest of the tufted velvet sofa, the sharp smack echoing loudly against the vaulted ceiling. "Shut your mouth right now, Kiara!" She snapped, her voice shrill and trembling with absolute blinding indignation. "You are being absolutely pathetic. You waltz into this house looking like a homeless vagrant refused to help your family in a moment of minor inconvenience, and then have the audacity to sit there and criticize your father's brilliant financial moves." She stood up, her face twisting into a mask of pure elite condescension. You are completely consumed by your own extreme jealousy. You cannot stand the fact that Preston is building a revolutionary tech empire while you are scrubbing grease off cheap baking pans in a rented kitchen. You are just bitter and jealous that we are securing our legacy and multiplying our wealth, and you are entirely written out of it. We do not need your uneducated financial advice, and we certainly do not need your toxic, miserable jealousy poisoning this room. I looked at the family assembled before me. Preston was literally sweating through the fabric of his custom suit, his eyes darting frantically around the room, knowing the absolute truth of his own bankruptcy. Chloe was entirely oblivious, clinging tightly to her mother's fabricated narrative of superiority. Marcus was doubling down on his pride, completely unwilling to admit he had made a fatal error. I gave them one last lingering look, committing the scene to memory. The grand, sprawling estate suddenly felt like a beautifully decorated tomb. "Enjoy your magnificent legacy," I said quietly, my voice devoid of any anger or malice. "I truly hope Preston's imaginary startup is worth losing the roof over your heads." I turned on my heel and walked out of the formal living room, my footsteps clicking in a steady, measured rhythm across the Italian marble of the grand foyer. No one followed me. No one called out. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out into the humid, thick Atlanta air. The transition was immediate. The very moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, the impoverished, struggling caterer persona dissolved entirely. I rolled my shoulders back, my posture instantly shifting from defensive isolation to absolute commanding authority. I walked down the sweeping brick steps to my unremarkable hybrid rental car, unlocked it, and slid into the driver's seat. The plush standard interior felt suffocatingly mundane, but it served its purpose perfectly as a disguise. I pulled my smartphone from my purse, bypassed the biometric security encryption, and dialed a highly secure international number. It rang exactly twice. "Good afternoon, Ms. Vance," the crisp, professional voice of Jonathan. My chief financial officer filled the car's Bluetooth audio system. "Jonathan, I need you to pull up the recent residential collateral files for our subsidiary company, Onyx Horizon Capital," I instructed, putting the rental car in gear and accelerating smoothly past the wrought iron gates of my parents' soon-to-be former home. "Right away." "Is there a specific portfolio or region you want me to isolate?" "Yes. Run a search for a secondary commercial mortgage application finalized within the last 48 hours. The primary applicant is Marcus Vance. The collateral property is a residential estate located in the Buckhead district of Atlanta. The loan was likely brokered through an external third-party digital portal by a man named Preston Sterling. I could hear the rapid, efficient clicking of Jonathan's keyboard through the speakers. "I have it right here on my screen, Ms. Vance. $3 million cash-out refinance. The collateral is the entire primary residence. It was approved yesterday afternoon through our automated high-risk, high-yield tier due to a lack of verifiable, consistent income from the primary applicant." "Excellent," I said, a cold, dangerous thrill curling in the pit of my stomach. "I want that specific file flagged for an immediate, comprehensive internal audit. Freeze the disbursement of funds if the wire has not cleared yet. If the funds have already cleared their bank, I want a daily tracking protocol placed on the destination account. Preston Sterling is currently carrying a massive federal tax lien and a string of defaulted personal loans. I need to know exactly how much of my father's $3 million he uses to quietly pay off the IRS, and how much he attempts to siphon into offshore shadow accounts." "Understood completely," Jonathan confirmed, his tone reflecting the ruthless, calculating efficiency I paid him so well for. "Should I notify our legal compliance team regarding the broker's active federal tax status?" "Not yet," I replied smoothly, navigating the car onto the main highway leading back to the city. "Let them dig the hole a little deeper. My father willingly signed the contract. Let them breach it on their own terms. The absolute second they miss a single clause in the repayment schedule, or the moment Preston's fraud is legally actionable, I want Onyx Horizon Capital to initiate our most aggressive foreclosure protocol. I want the default notices served by a courier directly to their front door." We will have the legal machinery primed and ready to execute upon your explicit signal, Jonathan assured me. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The trap was perfectly set, flawlessly disguised by their own breathtaking arrogance. My parents had willingly sold their souls and their home to fund the desperate delusions of a bankrupt con artist, entirely unaware that the invisible corporate titan holding the contract was their own discarded daughter. Camera action medium tracking shot as Kiara pours herself another glass of water. I stood in the sprawling, marble-clad kitchen of my actual residence, a tri-level penthouse overlooking the glittering Atlanta skyline, and watched the condensation bead on the side of my crystal glass. The miserable decoy apartment was already a relic of the past, its lease terminated the moment Preston and Chloe had scrambled out of its peeling doorway. I was back in my true domain, breathing filtered climate-controlled air, waiting for the inevitable dominoes to fall. The digital clock on my kitchen island flipped to exactly 8 in the morning. Right on cue, my secure corporate line vibrated against the granite countertop. "Good morning, Ms. Vance," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the crisp clinical satisfaction of an executioner confirming a successful drop. The 30-day billing cycle concluded at exactly midnight. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my ice water. And the result? Total default. Jonathan confirmed. The primary applicant, Marcus Vance, and the co-signer, Preston Sterling, have officially missed the very first payment of the $3 million secondary mortgage. They did not initiate a wire transfer, they did not mail a physical check, and they did not request an extension through the portal. It is a catastrophic breach of contract. I smiled, setting my glass down. My father, the man who had spent his entire life lecturing me on financial responsibility and legacy preservation, had just defaulted on a predatory loan within the first 30 days. He had handed the keys to his ancestral castle to a shadow corporation and immediately failed to meet the absolute basic requirements of the agreement. Where did the initial $3 million go? Jonathan, I asked, tracing the rim of my glass. I assume Preston did not use it to secure server space for his revolutionary tech startup. Jonathan let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Not a single cent went toward technology software or business development. Our forensic accounting team tracked the wire the moment it hit Preston Sterling's corporate account. The capital fractured instantly. He wired $1.2 million directly to the Internal Revenue Service. I nodded silently. He had used my parents' home equity to pay off a massive chunk of his active federal tax lien, desperately buying himself another few months of freedom before the criminal division indicted him for tax evasion. "And the remaining $1.8 million, I prompted. "Laundered," Jonathan stated flatly. He funneled the cash through 3 separate newly registered shell companies in Delaware to intentionally obscure the origin. From there, the funds were wired directly into a blind offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. He is actively hiding the remaining capital from his bankruptcy proceedings. He stole your parents' equity, paid off the government to keep himself out of prison, and buried the rest in the sand. The sheer breathtaking sociopathy of Preston's maneuver was almost poetic. He had completely gutted his wealthy in-laws to save his own skin. Marcus and Valerie were now left holding a toxic, defaulted mortgage on a heavily leveraged estate, while the man who orchestrated their ruin was actively hoarding their cash in the Caribbean. They were entirely exposed. They had zero liquidity, zero legal recourse, and absolutely zero idea that the guillotine blade had already been released. "Draft the foreclosure execution documents immediately," I commanded, my voice dropping to a lethal, uncompromising timbre. "I want the maximum penalty clauses activated. Trigger the immediate asset seizure protocol. Prepare the legal filings to change the locks. Freeze the remaining collateral and permanently transfer the deed of the Buckhead estate directly into my primary holding company. I want them stripped of every single brick, every blade of grass, and every ounce of equity. I have the paperwork ready for your digital signature now." "Ms. Vance," Jonathan replied efficiently. "Shall I dispatch our priority courier service to serve the notice of default and foreclosure directly to the estate this afternoon? We can have local law enforcement on standby to facilitate the immediate eviction process." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, staring down at the sprawling city below. I pictured a process server handing a manila envelope to my father in the quiet, isolated privacy of his grand foyer. I pictured my mother immediately spinning a web of lies, locking the doors, and hiding their absolute ruin from their elite social circle. I pictured them maintaining their arrogant facade while secretly packing their bags in the dead of night. No, I said softly. That would be far too merciful. Serving them in the privacy of their own home would allow them to maintain the illusion of control. It would allow them to hide their shame from the people whose opinions they valued more than their own daughter's life. I did not just want their house. I wanted their entire, carefully constructed, fraudulent reality burned to the ground in front of a live audience. Hold the courier, Jonathan. I instructed, a cold, predatory thrill racing through my veins. Do not serve the documents at the estate. Print the official foreclosure execution, place it in a premium leather portfolio, and have it delivered directly to me by noon tomorrow. Understood, Ms. Vance. May I ask how you intend to serve them? I turned away from the window, my reflection catching in the polished black marble of the kitchen island. This Saturday is the annual Country Club Gala, I explained, savoring the absolute perfection of the timing. It is the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta's elite social calendar. My parents will be there sitting at a VIP table they likely bought with their last remaining scraps of credit. Chloe and Preston will be there parading around in designer clothes funded by stolen equity, pretending to be financial royalty. Half the city's politicians, investors, and socialites will be in attendance. I paused, letting the devastating reality of my plan settle over the secure line. I am going to put on a very expensive gown, Jonathan. I am going to walk into that ballroom, and I am going to publicly hand my father the foreclosure documents in front of every single person he has ever tried to impress. I am going to execute the seizure of his beloved estate while he is drinking expensive champagne. It will be a bloodbath, Ms. Vance. Jonathan noted a hint of genuine awe in his usually stoic voice. It will be a reckoning, I corrected him coldly. Prepare the files. The eviction notice gets delivered with dessert. Camera action, gentle panning shot capturing the elegant environment surrounding Kiara. I disconnected the secure line with Jonathan and let the silence of my true life wash over me. The penthouse was a fortress of quiet, absolute control wrapped in walls of floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the glittering Atlanta skyline. Down below, the city crawled with millions of people chasing illusions of wealth. Up here, I owned the reality of it. A sharp, dissonant chime from my personal cell phone broke the stillness. I picked the device up from the edge of the granite kitchen island. The notification banner displayed an incoming email from my sister Chloe. The subject line read, with her typical lack of warmth, "This weekend's gala." I tapped the screen, opening the message. Chloe had never possessed an ounce of subtlety, but this particular correspondence was a breathtaking masterclass in elite, ignorant cruelty. Kiara. The email began, skipping any semblance of a familial greeting. I am writing to formally request that you do not attend the annual Country Club Gala this Saturday. Preston has invited several of his highly prominent, wealthy white relatives from Connecticut. They are flying in specifically to celebrate his new fintech venture and assess potential investments. We have a very specific, polished image to uphold for them. Frankly, your cheap wardrobe, your lack of basic class, and your overall abrasive attitude will only serve to embarrass Preston and humiliate the family in front of crucial company. We need this evening to be absolutely flawless. Having a bitter, struggling caterer lingering around our table is simply not an option we can accommodate. Please respect our boundaries for once and stay home. I read the words twice, letting the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her entitlement settle into my bones. The delusion was almost surgical. She was formally uninviting me from a high society charity gala hosted at a country club where my parents' membership was currently being floated by maxed-out credit cards. She was worried that my cheap wardrobe and lack of class would offend Preston's elite relatives completely, and blissfully oblivious to the fact that her visionary husband was a bankrupt con artist who had just committed federal fraud. He had mortgaged her parents' future into oblivion, just to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary, and she was worried about my manners. I did not draft a lengthy emotional response. I did not justify my existence, defend my career, or demand a seat at their pitiful table. I simply tapped the reply button, selected a single thumbs-up emoji, and hit send. Let them have their flawless evening. I was going to give them a night they would never, ever forget. I tossed the cell phone back onto the counter and walked into my home office. It was a sleek, minimalist space dominated by a massive custom-built mahogany desk. I opened my encrypted laptop and pulled up the confidential contact directory for the Luminary Hospitality Group. I scrolled past the regional managers and corporate acquisitions directors, finding the direct private mobile number for Beatrice Sterling, the head of the organizing committee for the annual Country Club Gala. I picked up the heavy receiver of my desk phone and dialed. Beatrice answered on the very first ring, her voice dripping with the practiced syrupy warmth reserved exclusively for high-net-worth donors. "Ms. Vance, what an absolute honor to hear from you, Beatrice," gushed the forced enthusiasm radiating through the line. "We were just finalizing the seating chart for Saturday evening. I simply cannot express how thrilled we are to have the Luminary Hospitality Group returning as our top-tier platinum sponsor this year. Your corporate donation single-handedly funded our entire silent auction." The irony was thick and delicious. Chloe and my mother had likely spent their entire year desperately lobbying the committee just to secure a mid-tier table near the back of the ballroom, leveraging my father's rapidly fading reputation to maintain their social standing. Meanwhile, the very gala they treated like the pinnacle of human achievement was fundamentally bankrolled by the bitter caterer they had just banished. "Thank you, Beatrice," I replied, my voice smooth, modulated, and carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "I am calling to confirm my personal attendance for this Saturday. I will be utilizing the Platinum sponsor table." "Oh, absolutely, Ms. Vance. We have a wonderful prominent table reserved for your corporate entity right near the orchestra pit." "I am going to need you to adjust that placement, Beatrice." I interrupted my tone, dropping to a level that left absolutely zero room for negotiation. "I do not want to be near the orchestra. I want the premier VIP table, the one directly in the geographic center of the ballroom. I want it positioned exactly equidistant between the main stage and the grand entrance with completely unobstructed sightlines to every single seat in the room. I want it to be the absolute focal point of the entire evening." There was a brief, panicked hesitation on the other end of the line. The syrupy warmth fractured. "Ms. Vance, I completely understand, but that specific table is traditionally reserved for the club president and his immediate family. It might be quite difficult to—" "Beatrice," I cut in, dropping the temperature of my voice to absolute zero. "Luminary Hospitality just authorized a $500,000 charitable contribution to your organization. If moving a centerpiece and a few chairs is too difficult for your committee to manage, I can easily have my chief financial officer recall the wire transfer before the bank closes today. I am certain the Atlanta Children's Hospital would be more than happy to accommodate my specific seating preferences at their winter fundraiser." The threat landed with the lethal precision of a sniper strike. The warmth instantly returned to Beatrice's voice, now laced with genuine, palpable terror. "No, no, that will not be necessary at all, Ms. Vance." She backpedaled frantically, her words tripping over themselves. "Consider it done. The center VIP table is yours. Will you be filling all 12 seats with your corporate executive team?" "No," I said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face as I stared out at the city skyline. "I will be attending alone. Remove the other 11 chairs. I want one single setting at that massive table." "One setting?" Beatrice asked, clearly baffled by the bizarre request. "Just you." At a 12 top in the dead center of the room. "Exactly," I confirmed. "Just me." I wanted the psychological dominance of that visual. I wanted my family to walk into that ballroom and see a single solitary figure commanding the most powerful piece of real estate in the building. I wanted Chloe to see exactly what a lack of class looked like when it was holding the deed to her entire life. I wanted Preston's wealthy white relatives to ask him who the mysterious, untouchable woman sitting alone at the platinum sponsor table was, and I wanted Preston to choke on his own breath when he realized it was the sister-in-law he had just tried to swindle. And, Beatrice, I added smoothly, tracing the edge of my mahogany desk, please ensure that the table reserved for Marcus and Valerie Vance is positioned with a direct, unavoidable line of sight to my seat. I have a very important, highly confidential document to deliver to them during the dessert course, and I want to make sure they do not miss a single second of the presentation. Consider it handled. Ms. Vance, Beatrice promised, her voice trembling slightly with a mix of awe and fear. We look forward to hosting you. I placed the receiver back onto its cradle, the sharp click echoing in the silent, cavernous office. The pieces were flawlessly set. My family had spent my entire life building their fragile, glittering house of cards on a foundation of lies, debt, and toxic arrogance. They had pushed me out, underestimated me, and finally they had handed me the very weapon needed to destroy them. They were going to walk into that gala expecting to cement their high society legacy. Instead, they were going to walk directly into a public execution, and I was going to enjoy every single second of pulling the lever. The heavy oak doors of the Atlanta Grand Country Club were thrown wide open, spilling golden light and the sound of a live string quartet onto the manicured valet drive. Saturday evening had arrived, bringing with it the absolute pinnacle of the city's high society. Marcus and Valerie Vance stepped out of their recently leased Bentley, instantly adopting the posture of reigning royalty. Valerie wore a heavily beaded gown she had likely secured on a line of credit that was quietly bleeding them dry. Marcus adjusted his tuxedo lapels, projecting the image of a titan of industry, completely oblivious to the fact that he no longer owned the very roof over his head. Right behind them, Chloe clung tightly to Preston's arm. Preston's smile was rigid and practiced, his skin bearing a faint, clammy sheen that no amount of expensive cologne could mask. They were hovering near the velvet ropes of the red carpet entrance, aggressively networking and waiting to greet Preston's wealthy white relatives from Connecticut. This was their moment, their grand stage to legitimize Preston's phantom tech empire and secure the capital he desperately needed to keep his sinking ship afloat. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and old money. Flashbulbs snapped as local social photographers captured the arrivals. Beatrice, the head of the organizing committee, was fluttering around the entrance, directing the wealthiest donors toward the ballroom. I watched it all unfold through the tinted, bulletproof glass of my custom Maybach Pullman as it glided smoothly up the sweeping circular driveway. The massive vehicle bypassed the standard valet line, entirely pulling directly into the designated VIP drop-off zone right at the base of the red carpet. The sheer presence of the Maybach commanded immediate attention. Conversations halted. The flashbulbs stopped for a fraction of a second, then doubled in intensity as the paparazzi sensed the arrival of someone who truly mattered. Marcus, Valerie, Chloe, and Preston all turned their heads, expecting to see a governor, a major celebrity, or perhaps the highly anticipated Connecticut investors. My personal driver stepped out, walking around the hood with military precision, and pulled open my door. I stepped out onto the plush red carpet. The collective gasp from my family was audible even over the din of the crowd. I was not wearing the flour-stained apron of a struggling caterer, nor was I wearing the simple, unassuming clothes they were accustomed to seeing me in. I was draped in a breathtaking, custom-made, midnight blue haute couture gown that clung to my frame like liquid sapphire. The fabric caught the ambient light, shimmering with every calculated movement. But the dress was merely the canvas. Around my neck rested a collar of authentic, flawless, brilliant-cut diamonds, with matching stones dropping from my ears and encircling my wrist. It was the kind of jewelry that did not just speak of wealth, it screamed of absolute untouchable power. Marcus actually dropped his crystal tumbler of scotch. It shattered against the pavement, the amber liquid splashing across his polished shoes. Valerie's jaw unhinged, her face draining of all color until her expensive foundation looked like a cheap mask. Preston stumbled backward, physically retreating as if he had just seen a ghost. But Chloe, fueled by a lifetime of toxic entitlement and blind arrogance, reacted exactly as I knew she would. Her face twisted into a furious, ugly sneer. She dropped Preston's arm and marched directly past the velvet ropes, her heels clicking aggressively against the pavement as she intercepted me right in the middle of the red carpet. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper meant to evade the microphones of the nearby press. "I sent you an email. I explicitly uninvited you from this gala. You cannot just rent a fancy car, slap on some fake cubic zirconia, and crash an event that costs $10,000 a plate. Preston's family is arriving any second. You are going to ruin everything." I stopped walking. I looked down at my sister, my expression entirely serene, utterly unbothered by her frantic, desperate energy. "You seem incredibly tense for a woman celebrating a multi-million-dollar tech launch, Chloe," I noted smoothly, my voice carrying just enough volume to force her to step closer. "I am not playing games with you, Kiara." Chloe spat, her eyes darting nervously toward the flashing cameras. "You are embarrassing us. Turn around, get back in your little rental car, and leave before I have you thrown out. You do not belong here. You have zero class, zero money, and zero right to breathe the same air as the people in this club." I smiled, a slow, razor-sharp curve of my lips. "Are you going to throw me out yourself, Chloe? Or are you going to ask the staff to do it?" "Watch me!" she snarled. She raised her hand and frantically waved over the towering, broad-shouldered man standing by the entrance doors. Davis, the country club's chief of security, immediately noticed the commotion and began marching down the red carpet toward us, two earpiece-wearing guards flanking him. Chloe crossed her arms, a smug, triumphant smirk replacing her panic. "I warned you, Kiara. Now you get to be publicly humiliated." "Davis," she called out as the security chief approached. "This woman is trespassing. She is not on the guest list. She is harassing my family, and she is causing a massive disruption. Remove her from the premises immediately." Davis stopped. He was a seasoned professional, a man who dealt with the tantrums of the elite on a nightly basis. He looked at Chloe, his face a mask of absolute neutrality. Then he turned his attention entirely to me. Chloe waited for him to grab my arm. She waited for the ultimate vindication, the moment her struggling, pathetic older sister was dragged off the red carpet in front of Atlanta's finest. Instead, Davis planted his feet, clasped his hands in front of him, and executed a deep, highly respectful bow. "Good evening, Ms. Vance," Davis said, his voice booming with profound deference, completely ignoring Chloe's existence. "It is an absolute honor to have you with us tonight. Beatrice and the executive committee are waiting for you inside." Chloe froze. Her triumphant smirk dissolved into an expression of sheer, unadulterated cognitive dissonance. She looked from Davis to me, her brain completely unable to process the data it was receiving. She opened her mouth, but only a sharp, breathless squeak came out. I stepped past her, the silk train of my gown sweeping gracefully over the red carpet. I paused just as I drew level with her trembling shoulder, leaning in close so only she could hear my parting words. "You should really check the seating chart before you enter the ballroom, Chloe." I whispered, my tone laced with absolute lethal finality. "You might find that the people you think you are trying to impress are actually sitting at my table." I left Chloe standing there, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, and swept past the velvet ropes. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Grand Country Club was a spectacle of excessive floral arrangements, cascading crystal chandeliers, and the soft, synchronized murmur of old money networking. I glided directly to the geographic center of the room. True to Beatrice's frantic, terrified promise, an oversized 12-top table sat completely bare except for one single immaculate place setting. I took my seat. The visual impact was immediate, undeniable, and utterly devastating. Whispers ignited across the room like a dry brush fire as Atlanta's elite turned to stare at the solitary woman commanding the most powerful piece of real estate in the building. Camera action, Steadicam circling Kiara, isolating her power against the family's panic. The lens captured the profound shift in gravity. I sat completely serene, sipping sparkling water while my parents and sister were relegated to a cramped, awkwardly positioned table near the kitchen doors. Their faces were drawn and panicked as they realized the magnitude of their miscalculation. The wealthy Connecticut relatives they had so desperately tried to impress were already looking at Marcus and Valerie with thinly veiled confusion, wondering why the supposed tech visionary and his family were seated next to the swinging doors of the service entrance. I was not alone for long. When you hold the purse strings of half the commercial developments in the state, people gravitate to you. Within 10 minutes, I was flanked by 3 very specific, highly influential men who had crossed the room to pay their respects to the CEO of Luminary Hospitality. 2 were high-ranking federal banking regulators I frequently consulted with regarding international corporate acquisitions. The third was Richard Sterling, no relation to Preston, a prominent commercial real estate mogul who practically owned the Atlanta skyline. We were deep in a discussion about fluctuating commercial interest rates when a loud, aggressively arrogant voice shattered the refined atmosphere. Well, 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 if it is not the family charity case pretending to play dress-up, Preston announced. He marched up to my table, puffing his chest out like a threatened peacock. He had brought 2 of his wealthy Connecticut uncles with him, clearly intending to use me as a prop to establish his alpha status and impress his investors. He gestured dismissively at my custom midnight blue gown. I have to admit, Chiara the rental company did a fantastic job, and those cubic zirconias look almost real from a distance. But you really should not be sitting here. This table is clearly reserved for actual platinum sponsors, not the hired help taking a quick break. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. I slowly set my crystal glass down on the pristine white tablecloth. The 3 immensely powerful men standing around me stopped talking entirely, turning their collective attention to the sweating, red-faced man attempting to insult their peer. Preston. I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and absolutely lethal. Since you are so eager to network tonight, allow me to introduce you to my guests. This is Arthur and David, both senior directors with the Federal Reserve's Financial Oversight Committee. And I am certain you recognize Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Commercial Properties. Gentlemen, this is my brother-in-law, Preston. He is currently pitching himself to his family as a revolutionary financial technology entrepreneur. Richard Sterling let out a sharp barking laugh that echoed loudly over the gentle hum of the string quartet. He looked Preston up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated amusement, the kind reserved for a particularly pathetic court jester. A fintech entrepreneur, Richard repeated, swishing the amber bourbon in his heavy crystal glass. That is a fascinating career pivot, Preston. Tell me, how exactly does one launch a disruptive tech startup when your previous firm was liquidated in Chapter 7 bankruptcy just 6 months ago? I saw your name cross my desk when your office assets went to public auction. I heard the IRS slapped you with a $2 million tax lien for fraudulent write-offs. Did you finally manage to scrape together the cash to keep the federal agents off your back, or are you still actively dodging their calls? Preston's arrogant, smug sneer dissolved instantly. The blood drained from his face so rapidly he looked practically translucent under the chandelier light. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords completely failed him. Only a pathetic, wet stammer fell from his lips. His wealthy Connecticut uncles stared at him in absolute rigid horror, stepping away from him as if his financial ruin were a contagious disease. The men he had brought over to impress were now looking at him with abject disgust. Preston literally took a step backward, his knees visibly shaking beneath the fabric of his tailored trousers. He had been publicly exposed in front of his own family, his potential investors, and Atlanta's corporate elite. Bankrupt. The shrill, piercing shriek cut through the music like a siren. Chloe had followed her husband across the ballroom, arriving just in time to catch the tail end of the real estate mogul's cheerful assassination. She shoved her way past the Connecticut uncles, her eyes wide and manic, as she grabbed Preston's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "What is he talking about, Preston?" Chloe demanded, her voice rising in pitch and volume, completely abandoning any pretense of country club etiquette. "What bankruptcy? What federal tax lien? You told me the company was entering a highly confidential silent acquisition phase." Preston could not even look at his wife. He stared at the patterned carpet, sweat beading heavily on his forehead and dripping down his pale cheeks. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, fully aware that the trapdoor had just opened. Chloe's panic rapidly morphed into explosive, unhinged rage. "You lied to me!" she screamed, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent ballroom. Every head in the venue turned toward the commotion. "You told my parents you were a visionary. You made them leverage the entire family estate to fund your new company. Where did that $3 million go? Preston, tell me where the money went." I sat back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap, and watched the marital conflict explode with spectacular, devastating precision. Camera action rack focus from a shimmering chandelier to Kiara's triumphant, icy gaze. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Chloe's frantic shrieks about federal fraud and missing millions had effectively paralyzed the room. Waiters froze in place, balancing silver trays of champagne. Atlanta's most elite socialites, politicians, and corporate titans stared in a mix of horror and undisguised fascination as Preston desperately tried to quiet his wife. He grabbed her wrists, his face purple with humiliation, only for her to violently slap his hands away. Before the altercation could devolve into physical violence or require country club security intervention, a sharp, piercing feedback whine echoed from the main stage speakers. Harrison Thorne, the venerable president of the country club, stood at the podium. He gripped the edges of the polished mahogany stand, clearing his throat loudly into the microphone to wrangle the shattered attention of the room. He shot a brief, deeply disapproving glare toward my family's table before composing his features into a mask of practiced professional warmth. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Harrison boomed, his voice resonating through the cavernous ballroom. "While we certainly appreciate a lively start to our annual gala, I would like to direct your attention to the main event of the evening. We are gathered here tonight not just for charity, but for a celebration of survival." The ballroom fell into a hushed, attentive silence. Even Chloe stopped screaming, her chest heaving as she glared at Preston in absolute disgust. As many of our senior board members are aware, Harrison continued, his tone dropping to a somber register. This beloved institution recently faced an unprecedented fiscal crisis. Due to unforeseen market volatility and some deeply unfortunate mismanagement, the Atlanta Grand Country Club was on the brink of permanent foreclosure. We were days away from closing our doors forever, but tonight we are not closing. Tonight we are expanding. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. We were saved at the absolute 11th hour by an anonymous corporate benefactor. Harrison announced, a genuine relieved smile breaking across his face. A private equity firm stepped in, cleared our institutional debt, completely funded our expansion project, and secured the future of this club for generations to come. The organizing committee has spent weeks trying to respect their request for anonymity. However, their chief executive officer graciously agreed to attend tonight, and she has permitted me to introduce her. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the center table and join me in welcoming the founder and CEO of Onyx Horizon Capital. The lighting technician hit his cue flawlessly. The ambient chandeliers dimmed, and a single brilliant white spotlight cut through the darkness, snapping directly onto my table. I placed my linen napkin on the table and stood up. The silence that overtook the ballroom was absolute. It was the kind of total, suffocating quiet that only occurs when hundreds of people simultaneously stop breathing. The spotlight caught the custom beadwork of my midnight blue gown, illuminating the flawless diamonds encircling my throat. I did not look at the crowd. I kept my gaze fixed dead ahead and began my walk toward the main stage. The path took me directly past the table where my family sat. I did not break my stride, but I allowed myself to briefly look down at them. Marcus was gripping the edge of his table so hard his knuckles were bone white, his jaw hanging completely slack. Valerie had a hand pressed over her heart, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked as though she were witnessing a biblical plague. Preston was sweating profusely, his hands shaking violently as his brain scrambled to process the corporate name Harrison had just announced. Onyx Horizon Capital. the exact shadow corporation that held the $3 million secondary mortgage on the Vance estate, the corporation he had just defaulted on. And then there was Chloe. All the rage had drained from her face, replaced by a hollow, vacant shock. She stared at my gown, at my diamonds, and at the absolute deference radiating from the country club president on the stage. The reality was crashing down on her in real time. The bitter, struggling caterer she had just commanded to leave the premises was the singular financial force keeping her entire social world intact. The sister she had always called a disappointment was a centimillionaire. I ascended the velvet-lined stairs to the stage. Harrison Thorne stepped aside, bowing his head respectfully as he handed me the microphone. I turned to face the ballroom, the spotlight warming my skin, and looked out over the sea of Atlanta's elite. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, ensuring that every single eye was locked onto me. "Good evening," I began, my voice ringing out crystal clear, devoid of any nervousness or hesitation. When my firm looks at a potential acquisition, we do not look at the facade. We look at the foundation. We live in a society obsessed with the illusion of wealth. People will leverage their ancestral homes, drain their equity, and commit outright federal fraud just to maintain a seat at a table they can no longer afford. A collective sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. Hundreds of eyes instantly darted toward Preston and Chloe. I had not named them, but the brutal surgical precision of my words immediately following Preston's public undressing by the real estate mogul left absolutely nothing to the imagination. But illusions always shatter. I continued, my icy gaze dropping directly to my father. He sat frozen, staring up at me, finally realizing that I held the deed to his entire fraudulent life. Financial literacy is not simply about generating revenue. It is about understanding inherent value. It is the ability to look at a distressed asset, recognize the rot within the foundation, and have the absolute unwavering discipline to cut off the dead weight. I paused, letting the lethal implication of the phrase settle over my family's table. Onyx Horizon Capital thrives on acquiring distressed assets from those who lack the discipline to manage them. I stated, my voice dropping to a smooth, commanding timbre. We strip away the fraud, we clear the debt, and we rebuild something of actual tangible worth. This country club had a rotting foundation. Now it has a future. To the board of directors, you are welcome. To the rest of you, I suggest you get your houses in order. The market is correcting itself tonight. I lowered the microphone. For 3 seconds, the ballroom remained trapped in a stunned, paralyzed silence. Then Richard Sterling stood up from his chair and began a slow, deliberate clap. Within moments, the entire ballroom erupted into deafening, thunderous applause. The elite corporate titans, the politicians, the wealthy investors, they were all on their feet, giving a standing ovation to the woman who had just publicly declared open season on fraudulent wealth. I handed the microphone back to a beaming Harrison Thorne. I did not look back at my family. They were already dead weight, and I was entirely finished carrying them. Camera action, handheld, slightly unstable camera movement to reflect the family's breaking reality. The applause was still ringing in my ears as I descended the velvet stairs of the stage. Before my satin heel could even touch the ballroom floor, a heavy, frantic hand clamped onto my forearm. I did not flinch. I simply turned my head, fixing my father with a glare so venomous he immediately dropped his grip as if he had been burned. Marcus Vance was breathing heavily. His tuxedo jacket rumpled, the polished veneer of the Atlanta patriarch completely shattered. Valerie was right beside him, her eyes darting nervously around the room, acutely aware of the hundreds of gazes suddenly tracking their every movement. Behind them, Chloe and Preston hovered like condemned prisoners waiting for the drop. "We need to speak privately," Marcus demanded, his voice a harsh, breathless whisper. "Right now, Kiara." I smoothly adjusted the diamond collar around my neck, savoring the raw desperation radiating from his pores. "Led the way, Marcus," I said calmly. They ushered me through a set of heavy mahogany doors just off the main hall, spilling into an opulent, soundproofed VIP suite reserved for the club's elite board members. The heavy doors clicked shut instantly, muffling the roar of the gala outside. The camera's perspective shifted, the framing slightly unmoored, capturing the frantic, spinning reality of a family whose entire universe had just been fundamentally inverted. For 3 seconds, nobody spoke. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating, and thick with the stench of Preston's nervous sweat. I stood perfectly still in the center of the plush Persian rug, waiting for the inevitable pivot. I knew my mother better than I knew myself. I knew exactly how long it would take for the shock of my wealth to bypass her shame and activate her bottomless parasitic greed. It took exactly 4 seconds. Valerie's face underwent a horrifying, miraculous transformation. The pale terror vanished instantly, replaced by a wide, trembling, sickeningly sweet smile. She rushed forward, throwing her arms out as if she were about to pull me into a maternal embrace. I took one deliberate half-step backward, and her arms dropped awkwardly to her sides. "Oh, Kiara." Valerie breathed, pressing a hand to her chest. "My brilliant, incredible girl, we are just so overwhelmed. Onyx Horizon Capital. I cannot believe it. All these years you were building this massive empire right under our noses. I always told your father, I always said Kiara is the smart one. Kiara is the one with the real drive. We were hard on you, yes, but only because we knew you had this exact kind of greatness inside you." I stared at her, my face a mask of absolute stone. The sheer breathtaking delusion required to rewrite 35 years of emotional abuse and financial neglect into a narrative of tough love parenting was almost impressive. Marcus nodded vigorously, stepping up beside his wife, eagerly latching onto the new narrative. "It is true, Kiara. We always wanted to push you to your absolute limits. And look at what you have achieved. It is extraordinary. You have saved the club. You have cemented the Vance family legacy in this city forever." Valerie stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with a manic, hungry light. "And the timing simply could not be more perfect, darling. We are family, and family protects each other's wealth. You know Preston is right on the verge of launching his new financial technology firm. He just needs a tiny bridge loan to secure the final server space. A few million is nothing to a company like Onyx Horizon. You can fund his business, become the primary angel investor, and keep the profits entirely within the family. Oh, and your father and I were just looking at a gorgeous little beachfront estate in Maui. We could finally buy that Hawaii house and use it as a corporate retreat for your executives." I looked at my mother. I looked at my father. I looked at Chloe, who was suddenly staring at me with a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope, silently praying that I would save her fraudulent lifestyle. Finally, I looked at Preston. He was not looking at me. He was staring at the floor, his face the color of wet ash, because Preston was the only one in the room who actually understood how corporate debt acquisition worked. He knew exactly what was about to happen. A low, genuine laugh bubbled up from my throat. It echoed off the wood-paneled walls, cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of humor. The sound made Valerie's manic smile falter. "Fund Preston's business." I repeated the words, dripping with absolute contempt. "Buy you a house in Hawaii." I reached into the oversized, sleek leather clutch I had deliberately paired with my gown. I pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder, the edges stamped with the ominous red seal of the state of Georgia's real estate division. I did not hand it to my father. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table separating us. It hit the surface with a heavy, definitive smack. "I am not funding anything," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, uncompromising register. "I am here to collect." Marcus frowned, his brow furrowing as he looked down at the folder. "Collect? Collect what, Kiara? What is this?" "That, Marcus, is the official notarized notice of default," I explained smoothly, watching his eyes widen as he slowly reached for the folder. 30 days ago, you and Valerie took out a $3 million secondary mortgage on the Buckhead estate, utilizing an expedited corporate loan structure to bypass standard banking regulations. You co-signed that loan and handed the capital directly over to Preston for his so-called tech venture. You leveraged the ancestral home to save your favorite son-in-law. Marcus's hands began to shake as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. Valerie let out a sharp gasp. The lender on that note was a subsidiary shell company. I continued pacing slowly around the edge of the glass table, circling them like a predator. A subsidiary fully owned and operated by Onyx Horizon Capital. "I bought your debt, Marcus. I own the mortgage." And according to the ironclad non-negotiable terms of that agreement, the very first monthly payment was due exactly 48 hours ago, a payment that was never made. I did not make the payment because Preston was supposed to handle the corporate transfer. Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he turned furiously toward his son-in-law. Preston, what is she talking about? You said the initial capital would easily cover the first year of interest. Preston did not use the money for a tech venture, Dad, I said coldly, cutting off Preston before he could even attempt to form a lie. He did not buy server space. He did not hire developers. The minute that $3 million hit his account, he wired $1.2 million directly to the Internal Revenue Service to pay off a massive active federal tax lien to avoid immediate criminal indictment. Chloe let out a horrified, strangled cry, backing away from her husband as if he held a live grenade. And the remaining $1.8 million, I asked rhetorically, locking eyes with Preston. He funneled it through 3 newly registered shell companies in Delaware and wired it directly into a blind offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. He stole your equity, paid off the government to save his own skin, and buried the rest in the sand to hide it from his impending bankruptcy proceedings. You little bastard, Marcus roared, lunging toward Preston. Valerie screamed, grabbing her husband's arm to hold him back. Preston cowered, raising his hands in a pathetic defensive gesture. Sit down, Marcus. I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip, freezing the room instantly. Do not pretend you are the victim here. You willingly signed away your home because you were too arrogant to actually read the financial disclosures and too obsessed with maintaining a fraudulent country club image to realize you were being conned by a desperate amateur. I tapped the folder on the glass table with a single manicured fingernail. You are in catastrophic default, I stated, the reality finally hammering the final nail into their coffin. The grace period is over. The maximum penalty clauses have been activated. The documents in that folder are the official foreclosure execution and immediate asset seizure protocols. I am taking the Buckhead estate. I am seizing the cars, the accounts, and every single ounce of collateral tied to that property. By Monday morning, the deed will be permanently transferred to my primary holding company, and the locks will be changed. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever fits into your leased Bentley and vacate my property. Valerie collapsed onto the leather sofa, burying her face in her hands, her performative high society facade entirely destroyed. Marcus stood paralyzed, staring at the foreclosure notice as his entire world, his legacy, and his identity burned to the absolute ground. Chloe was sobbing hysterically, screaming at Preston, who was hyperventilating near the door. I looked at the people who had spent 35 years making me feel like I was nothing. They were broken, bankrupt, and entirely exposed. I turned my back on them and walked toward the mahogany doors. Enjoy the rest of the gala, I said over my shoulder, my hand resting on the brass handle. I hear the dessert is fantastic. I pushed the heavy brass handle downward, the latch clicking loudly in the quiet room. Wait! Chloe's voice cracked, sharp, desperate, and entirely stripped of its usual arrogance. You are lying. You have to be lying. Preston is a builder. He is a visionary. He comes from old money. He would never do this to us. Camera action. Slow zoom into Kiara's face as she systematically destroys the golden child's world. I released the door handle and slowly turned back around to face my sister. Her makeup was beginning to run dark tracks, ruining her flawless aesthetic. Preston was shaking his head, mouthing the word "no" silently, his eyes wide with the terror of a trapped animal. I did not stop. I walked back to the glass table. I flipped the manila folder open, bypassing the foreclosure notices, and pulled out a separate stack of heavily redacted banking records. A visionary, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air, tasting the absolute irony of it. The great white savior of the Vance family legacy. Let us take a very close look at his vision, Chloe. I tossed a thick stack of Cayman Island bank statements directly onto the glass in front of her. These are the offshore trust records. When Jonathan, my wealth manager, traced the missing $1.8 million, we initially assumed he was just hoarding it for his personal bankruptcy. But Preston is not a mastermind. He is not a tech genius. He is just a degenerate. Chloe stared at the papers, her hands trembling as she picked them up. What are these wire transfers? The Bellagio, the Venetian Grand Macao. These are not tech acquisitions. Gambling debts. Chloe. I stated, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving timbre. Massive, insurmountable, highly illegal gambling debts. Your visionary husband has a crippling addiction to high-stakes baccarat and sports betting. He blew through his own company's capital, tanked his firm, and triggered a federal investigation. When the bookies and the feds closed in, he realized he needed an immediate, untraceable bailout. So he looked at his eager, status-obsessed in-laws, who were so desperate to secure their place in high society that they would blindly sign anything a man with a Connecticut pedigree handed them. He saw the perfect marks. I pointed to the dates highlighted on the statements, forcing her to look at the undeniable proof. He manipulated Marcus into taking out a second mortgage on the family estate under the guise of an early-stage tech investment. He used your parents' home equity to pay off the IRS just to delay his indictment, and he funneled the rest to offshore accounts to pay off men who break legs for a living. He is completely broke, Chloe. And the best part: the federal prosecutors already have these records. The indictment for wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion is being drafted as we speak. He is going to federal prison. Chloe dropped the papers as if the pages themselves had caught fire. She turned slowly to look at Preston. He was backed against the mahogany-paneled wall, sweating profusely, looking entirely pathetic. The illusion of the polished, wealthy executive had completely melted away, leaving behind a terrified, sniveling fraud. "Is it true?" Chloe whispered, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, unhinged energy. "Tell me it is a lie, Preston. Tell me you did not mortgage my parents' house to pay off casino debts." Preston raised his hands in a weak, defensive posture, shrinking away from her. "Chloe, sweetie, you have to understand, I was down, but I had a system. The math was foolproof. If I just had a little more time, I could have won it all back. I swear to God. I was going to replace the money before Marcus even noticed the first payment was due. It was just a bridge loan, baby. Just a temporary bridge loan." The sound of a slap cracked through the VIP room with the force of a gunshot. Chloe lunged at him violently, shoving him against the wood paneling. "You parasitic loser!" she screamed, her nails raking across his tailored lapel. "You ruined us. You made me look like an absolute fool. I defended you. I paraded you around this club, telling everyone you were the next big thing." She shoved him again, her perfect, highly curated marriage shattering into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. Preston stumbled, completely emasculated, putting his arms up to shield his face from his hysterical, screaming wife. Marcus collapsed back into a leather armchair, clutching his chest. His breathing was shallow and rapid as he stared blankly at the ceiling. The reality of losing his ancestral estate to the daughter he despised and surrendering his dignity to a conman had effectively paralyzed him. His heart was likely working overtime, but I felt zero inclination to call for a medic. Valerie, however, was not paralyzed. Her instinct for social survival was far too deeply ingrained. My mother scrambled up from the sofa and threw herself across the room, grabbing my arm with a desperate claw-like grip. Her eyes were wide, manic, and entirely consumed by self-preservation. She did not care that her son-in-law had betrayed them. She did not care that her home was gone. She only cared about the optics. "Kiara, listen to me," Valerie begged, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup and staining her expensive silk gown. "You have the money. You have Onyx Horizon. You can fix this. You can hire the best corporate defense lawyers in the country. You can bury these offshore records. You can pay off the mortgage, silence the feds, and sweep this entire mess under the rug." I stared down at the hands gripping my arm, feeling the absolute revulsion rise in my throat, then looked back up into her panicked face. "We can tell everyone it was a misunderstanding," Valerie pleaded, her voice cracking with hysteria, tightening her grip on my skin. "We can say you bought the house as a gift for the family. We can send Preston away to a luxury rehab in Malibu and tell the club he is on a spiritual retreat. We can save the family's reputation. Kiara, please. You cannot let Atlanta society see us like this. You cannot let us be humiliated in front of our friends. We are your family. You have to save us." My hand was resting heavily on the cool brass handle of the mahogany door. Before I could push it downward and step back into the glittering ballroom, a loud, heavy thud echoed behind me, vibrating through the plush Persian rug. Camera action over-the-shoulder shot from Kiara's perspective, looking down at her parents. I turned my head slowly. Marcus Vance, a man who had spent his entire adult life looking down his nose at everyone he deemed beneath his tax bracket, had physically thrown himself onto the floor. He crawled toward me, his tailored tuxedo trousers sliding awkwardly against the rug fibers, and grasped the hem of my midnight blue gown. His face was completely devoid of its usual arrogant color, replaced by an ashen, sickly gray. "Kiara, please!" Marcus begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, breathless wheeze. He was weeping. Real, ugly, desperate tears were spilling over his cheeks. "You cannot do this. You cannot take the house. It is the Vance estate. It is our legacy. It is where you grew up." I looked down at the man grasping my dress, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no residual familial loyalty, just a profound clinical disgust. "It was your legacy, Marcus," I stated, my voice echoing like ice cracking over a frozen lake. "You traded it for an illusion." He shook his head frantically, pointing a trembling finger across the room at Preston, who was still cowering against the far wall. "It was him," Marcus shouted, his voice rising in a panicked crescendo. "He lied to us. He manipulated me into signing those corporate loan documents. I never would have risked your childhood home if I knew he was covering gambling debts. Kiara, you have to believe me. You are my flesh and blood. You are my daughter. You have always been my favorite daughter. I always knew you were the special one. I always knew you were brilliant." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the lie hung in the air, so incredibly toxic, it almost possessed a physical weight. Valerie stood frozen behind him, her hands clamped over her mouth, not even daring to contradict the favorite daughter claim, because she was just as desperate to save herself. Chloe let out a wet, choked sob of absolute betrayal from her corner, realizing her father was actively throwing her under the bus to appease me, but Marcus did not even glance in her direction. He was entirely focused on his new savior. I took a deliberate step backward, pulling the fabric of my gown out of his damp, shaking hands. "Your favorite daughter," I repeated, testing the phrase on my tongue and finding it entirely rancid. I turned around, fully standing over him. I gestured toward the glass table where the thick manila folder rested. "Pick it up, Marcus." He hesitated, looking up at me with terrified eyes. "Pick up the foreclosure documents," I commanded. He scrambled onto his knees, his hands shaking violently as he reached for the folder, pulling it against his chest like a shield. "Read the name of the holding company again," I instructed smoothly. "Onyx Horizon Capital. Do you know when I founded that firm 7 years ago? 7 years of working 80-hour weeks. 7 years of sleeping on a mattress on the floor in a studio apartment while you funded Chloe's European vacations. 7 years of building a commercial real estate portfolio from the ground up while you told your country club friends I was a struggling caterer, just to spare yourself the perceived embarrassment of having a daughter who actually had to work for a living." Marcus opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, but I did not give him the oxygen. "Do not sit there on your knees and insult my intelligence by calling me your favorite," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper. "You made your feelings about me perfectly clear at your 30th anniversary dinner." I watched his face drain of whatever life it had left as he realized I remembered every single detail of that night. It was the night they had hosted a lavish catered affair at the estate for 200 of their closest socialite friends. I had spent my last $100 on a dress hoping to finally be included in the family photographs. Instead, they had deliberately left my name off the seating chart, hiding me away in the kitchen so I would not ruin their aesthetic. "You stood in our foyer adjusting your silk tie, looked me dead in the eye, and told me I was an embarrassment." I continued, leaning down so my face was level with his. I mirrored the exact tone he had used that night. Cold, dismissive, and utterly devoid of love. "Your exact words, Marcus, were, 'You are not part of us. You can stay behind. Marcus flinched violently, as if I had struck him across the jaw. The silence in the VIP room was absolute. Even Preston had stopped his frantic hyperventilating, pressing himself flat against the wood paneling, realizing he was witnessing the systematic execution of a patriarch. I straightened my posture, smoothing the heavy satin of my gown. You wanted me to stay behind. I simply followed your instructions. I stayed behind, I built a corporate empire, and now I own the very ground you stand on. The estate is legally mine. I reached into my designer clutch one final time and pulled out a crisp white envelope bearing the seal of my legal department. I dropped it onto the floor right in front of his knees. That envelope contains the formal legal mandate I stated, shifting into absolute, uncompromising corporate precision. You have exactly 14 days to vacate my property. 14 days to pack up your fraudulent lives, surrender the keys, and leave the premises. If you attempt to strip the house of fixtures, damage the property, or remove any assets tied to the collateral agreement, my legal team will press immediate criminal charges for destruction of corporate property. If you are still inside that house on day 15, I will have the Fulton County Sheriff's Department physically drag you out onto the front lawn. Valerie finally found her voice, stepping forward with her hands clasped together in a posture of desperate prayer. Kiara, where will we go? We have nothing liquid. Preston took everything. We cannot afford a hotel. We cannot afford an apartment lease. Our friends will see. Society will know. You cannot put your own mother out on the street like a common criminal. You should ask Chloe for a room, I replied smoothly, glancing at my sister, who was currently curled into a ball of misery on a velvet accent chair. After all, she is the one who married the visionary. I am sure Preston's offshore Cayman accounts can cover a budget motel until the federal marshals arrive to seize his remaining assets. Preston let out a pathetic whimper at the mention of the federal marshals sliding down the wall until he hit the floor. 14 days, I repeated, committing the timeline to their panicked minds. Do not test me, Marcus. I have the capital to bury you in litigation for the rest of your natural lives, and unlike you, I do not bluff. I turned the brass handle, pushing the heavy mahogany door open. The sound of the gala washed over me immediately. The string quartet had resumed playing a lively, upbeat classical piece that sharply contrasted with the absolute devastation I was leaving behind in that room. I stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door shut with a solid, satisfying click. I did not look back. I adjusted my posture, took a deep breath, and walked back into the ballroom. As I moved through the crowd, wealthy investors and prominent socialites parted like the Red Sea, offering me respectful nods and eager smiles. I accepted a fresh glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and rejoined Richard Sterling at the center table. The night was young, my portfolio was expanding, and the dead weight had finally been cut loose. Camera action static wide shot for a moment to capture the absolute despair of the family, then slowly pushing in. The heavy mahogany door was halfway open. The lively classical music from the ballroom spilling into the VIP suite when the sheer, unadulterated reality of their ruin finally snapped the last thread of family loyalty. I paused, my hand resting on the brass frame, and watched the implosion unfold. Desperation is a fascinating catalyst. It strips away etiquette, history, and maternal bonds in a matter of seconds, leaving only the primal, vicious instinct to survive. Valerie broke first. She whirled around, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure feral hatred as she looked at Chloe. "This is your fault!" Valerie shrieked, the sound raw and guttural, entirely devoid of her usual refined country club cadence. She lunged across the Persian rug, grabbing Chloe by the shoulders and shaking her violently. "You brought this criminal into our home. You told us he was a genius. You made us sign those papers." "Mom, stop!" Chloe sobbed, trying weakly to pry Valerie's manicured claws from her silk dress. "I did not know." He lied to me too. Marcus did not intervene to protect his golden child. Instead, he turned his wrath entirely onto Preston. My father, a man who had spent 3 decades meticulously cultivating an image of stoic Southern grace, launched himself at his son-in-law. He grabbed Preston by the lapels of his rented tuxedo and slammed him backward against the wood-paneled wall. You worthless, parasitic con artist! Marcus roared, spittle flying from his lips as he shook the younger man. I will kill you. I will personally drag you down to the federal courthouse and hand you over to the FBI. You stole my home. You stole my legacy. Preston merely whimpered, raising his arms to shield his face, completely paralyzed by the sheer violence of my father's panic. The perfect, curated facade of the Vance family was gone. In its place was a pack of starving wolves brutally turning on the weakest members of the herd to save their own skins. I stood in the doorway, perfectly still, watching the violent spectacle with clinical detachment. Valerie shoved Chloe aside, sending her stumbling into an armchair, and sprinted back across the room toward me. She threw herself onto the floor, her expensive gown pooling around her knees, and grabbed my hand. Her grip was tight, slick with sweat and desperation. Kiara, listen to me. Valerie hyperventilated, her eyes wide and bloodshot. We will disown her. We will cut Chloe out of the family entirely. We will testify against Preston. We will give the feds every single piece of financial documentation they need to lock him away for the rest of his miserable life. Just let us stay in the house, please. I am begging you. Marcus dropped Preston in a heap on the floor and scrambled over to join my mother. He dropped to his knees right beside her, abandoning every ounce of dignity he had ever possessed. He looked up at me, his face pale and slick with tears. We will cut them off today, Marcus promised, his voice trembling with eager, desperate betrayal. They are dead to us, Kiara. You are our only daughter now. You are the only one who matters. Just forgive the debt, please. You have hundreds of millions of dollars. The Buckhead estate is just a drop in the bucket for Onyx Horizon. Let us keep our home and we will never speak to Chloe again. We will do whatever you want. We will be the parents you always deserved. Chloe let out a strangled, horrified gasp from the corner of the room. She stared at the two people who had worshipped the ground she walked on since the day she was born. The parents who had leveraged their entire financial future to ensure she maintained her wealthy lifestyle. In the span of 5 minutes, they had gleefully offered her up as a sacrificial lamb just to keep their address. Mom, Dad. Chloe whispered, her voice cracking with absolute devastation. You cannot mean that. Shut up! Valerie screamed back at her without even turning her head. You ruined this family! Valerie looked back up at me, attempting to force a loving maternal smile through her hysterical tears. It was a grotesque, horrifying expression. We love you, Kiara. We have always loved you. Please just give us this one chance to prove it. I looked down at the two people kneeling at my feet. I looked at the tears streaming down their faces, the desperate pleading grasp of their hands, and the utter lack of hesitation with which they had just destroyed their favorite child. For my entire life I had craved exactly this. I had wanted them to look at me, to choose me, to value me over the superficial, hollow perfection of my sister. I had spent decades trying to earn a fraction of the devotion they were currently offering me. But as I looked at them now, I felt absolutely nothing. No vindication, no warmth, no residual desire for their affection. The well had finally permanently run dry. I gently but firmly pulled my hand out of Valerie's grip. I took a step back, putting distance between myself and their groveling. You do not love me, I said, my voice quiet, steady, and echoing with absolute finality. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but I raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. You proved today in this very room that your love is entirely conditional. I continued, my gaze sweeping over the pathetic wreckage of my family. It is not tied to loyalty. It is not tied to blood. Your love is only tied to whoever happens to hold the biggest bank account. Valerie let out a broken sob, shaking her head frantically. No, Kiara, that is not true, please. It is the absolute truth, I stated, my voice turning to ice. When Preston had the illusion of wealth, he was the golden sun, and I was the embarrassment you hid near the kitchen doors. Now that I hold the deed to your life, you are willing to throw your favorite daughter to the wolves without a second thought, just to save your country club membership. You are hollow, all of you. You do not love me. You love my money. I looked down at them one last time, making sure they understood that there was no negotiation, no hidden warmth, no possibility of redemption. "And you are getting neither," I said. I turned around, walked through the heavy mahogany doors, and stepped out into the bright glittering lights of the gala, leaving them alone in the dark with the wreckage they had created. Camera action tracking shot following Kiara as she turns her back on the chaos and walks away. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me, instantly, cutting off the shrill, desperate wailing of my mother and the pathetic, blubbering apologies of the men who had just ruined her life. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the chilled, floral-scented air. The gala was in full swing. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. The string quartet played a lively, upbeat piece that perfectly matched the rhythm of my pulse. For the first time in 35 years, my shoulders felt entirely light. The crushing weight of seeking validation from people incapable of giving it had completely evaporated. I signaled to a passing waiter, took a flute of champagne, and took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the crisp taste ground me in the present moment. I caught the eye of Harrison, the head of private security for the Onyx Horizon portfolio. He immediately stepped away from his post near the grand staircase and approached me, his expression professional and highly alert. "Harrison," I said, my voice steady and calm, carrying the unmistakable authority of a woman who was entirely in control. "There are 4 individuals in the VIP lounge: Marcus, Valerie, and Chloe Vance, along with Preston Hayes. They are no longer members of this club." Harrison nodded, his face impassive, waiting for the rest of the directive. What my family had failed to realize was that the Atlanta Heritage Country Club had been bleeding capital for a decade. Onyx Horizon had quietly purchased the majority debt 3 months ago, effectively making me the primary owner of the very ground my parents considered their sacred social sanctuary. In fact, I continued swirling the champagne in my glass. "They are officially trespassing on my property. Please have your team escort them to the service exit. If they resist, or if they attempt to cause a scene in front of the other guests, call the local authorities and have them arrested for public disturbance. Do not let them leave with anything they did not arrive with." "Understood," Ms. Vance, Harrison replied. He tapped his earpiece, signaling his team, and moved swiftly toward the lounge. I did not stay to watch the spectacle. I walked out the front doors, stepped into my waiting car, and drove back to the city, leaving my past exactly where it belonged. The aftermath was swift, brutal, and highly publicized. 3 days later, the illusion finally shattered for the rest of the world. Federal agents raided Preston's boutique investment firm at 8 in the morning. The local news helicopters caught the entire spectacle, broadcasting it live across the state. The great visionary, the man my parents had practically worshipped, was led out of his leased glass office building in handcuffs. He was sobbing openly, his tailored suit rumpled, as agents carried out boxes of hard drives and forged financial records. The charges included wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. There would be no luxury rehab in Malibu to save his reputation. The prosecution had an airtight case based on the offshore records my team had uncovered. He was looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Chloe's carefully curated, picture-perfect aesthetic disintegrated overnight. Without Preston's stolen funds to finance her lifestyle, her platinum credit cards declined immediately. She attempted a desperate pivot, posting a tearful victim narrative video to her millions of followers. She sat on the floor of her unfurnished living room, claiming she had been utterly deceived by a monster and asking for financial donations to help her start over. The internet, ever ruthless, immediately dug up the offshore account transfers and the second mortgage documents that bore her signature as a secondary guarantor. The backlash was swift and merciless. Brands dropped her within hours. Her sponsors issued public statements severing all ties. With her accounts frozen by the federal investigation and her social standing annihilated, she was forced to pack 2 suitcases and move into a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. Her days of playing the wealthy socialite were permanently over, replaced by peeling wallpaper and the stark realization that she possessed 0 actual skills to survive in the real world. For my parents, the fall from grace was absolute. When the 14th day arrived, they were still frantically trying to secure loans from their former country club friends. Not a single person returned their calls. High society is notoriously allergic to scandal, and the Vance name had become entirely toxic overnight. On the morning of the 15th day, I kept my exact promise. The Fulton County Sheriff's Department arrived at the estate. Marcus and Valerie, stripped of their arrogance and their wealth, were forced to pack whatever they could fit into a rented moving van while deputies watched with crossed arms. Their neighbors' people, they had spent decades trying to impress, stood on their manicured lawns and watched the eviction in hushed, judgmental silence. Marcus and Valerie relocated to a cramped, rundown two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood they used to roll their windows up while driving through. Their country club days were over forever. They were no longer the elites of Atlanta society. They were just two broke, aging individuals living with the catastrophic consequences of their own greed. They tried to contact me, of course. My corporate office received dozens of voicemails filled with empty apologies. They sent letters begging for a second chance, emails claiming they had finally seen the error of their ways, and text messages insisting that family should forgive and forget. I blocked their numbers, marked the emails as spam, and instructed my assistant to return all physical mail unopened. I had spent my entire childhood trying to earn a seat at their table, enduring their cruelty just to feel like I belonged. I had believed that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, and proved my worth, they would finally look at me the way they looked at Chloe. It took stripping away their wealth to realize that their table was entirely rotten to begin with. I did not need their approval. I did not need their conditional transactional love. I had built my own empire brick by brick, on a foundation of reality, immense hard work, and unyielding self-respect. I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, the cool night air rushing past me, as I looked out over the glittering skyline of the city I now owned a significant piece of. I raised a glass of wine to the quiet, forgotten girl who used to hide in the kitchen, desperate for a family that never truly existed. She had not just survived the fire they put her through, she had become it, and she was never looking back. Camera action. Slow dolly out, transitioning from the cold, glittering city skyline to the warm, loving atmosphere of the penthouse interior as Kiara smiles softly. I lowered my glass, the city lights reflecting in the crystal, and allowed myself a moment of absolute stillness. The silence up here was not the oppressive, judgmental quiet of the Vance family estate. It was the silence of total, uncompromising freedom. I had spent decades carrying the heavy, suffocating burden of their expectations, constantly twisting myself into knots, trying to win a game where the rules were rigged against me from the start. Now the board was flipped, the game was over, and I was the only player left standing. The soft chime of the private elevator interrupted my thoughts, followed by the heavy, reassuring click of the front door opening. The frantic, joyous clicking of claws on hardwood floors immediately broke the quiet. Cooper, our hopelessly affectionate golden retriever, bounded into the living room, his tail wagging with enough force to knock over a side table. I stepped back inside, sliding the glass balcony door shut, and turned to face the foyer. Julian walked in, bringing the warmth of the entire world with him. He looked effortlessly sharp, his tailored charcoal suit loosened at the collar after a long day of running his own highly successful architecture firm. But it was not his success that made my breath catch. It was the way he looked at me. It was a look completely devoid of calculation conditions or ulterior motives. Cradled securely against his broad chest was our 6-month-old daughter, Maya. She was fast asleep, her tiny fingers curled tightly into the fabric of his lapel, completely oblivious to the empire her mother had just secured for her future. Julian smiled, a genuine, easy expression that reached his dark, intelligent eyes. He walked over carefully, shifting Maya's weight to free one hand, and handed me a fresh glass of sparkling cider. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead. "You did it," he whispered, his voice a low, grounding rumble that instantly settled my remaining nerves. "It is over. You never have to deal with them again." I leaned into his warmth, feeling the last microscopic ounce of tension drain from my spine. "It is over," I confirmed, reaching out to gently stroke Maya's soft curls. Right now, somewhere across the city, Marcus and Valerie were sitting in a cramped, poorly lit apartment, blaming each other for their own catastrophic failures. Chloe was staring at the peeling wallpaper of a budget motel room, frantically refreshing a social media feed that had permanently canceled her. They were drowning in the very superficiality they had worshipped their entire lives. Meanwhile, I was standing in a home filled with genuine laughter, unwavering support, and absolute security. This was what a real family looked like. There was no seating chart. There were no hidden agendas, no offshore accounts, no frantic scrambling to maintain an illusion for people who secretly despised us. There was just us, anchored entirely in truth. Camera action. The shot pushes in slowly, centering on Kiara as Julian steps into the background to gently put the baby in her crib, leaving Kiara alone with the viewer. I looked directly into the lens, stripping away the corporate armor, leaving only the woman who had finally found her peace. For 35 years, I thought wealth was defined by the zip code of your estate, the designer label inside your collar, and the names on your country club guest list. I watched my parents sacrifice their dignity, their morals, and ultimately their own daughter, all to protect a fragile, bankrupt illusion of superiority. They chased society's approval until it literally left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. But true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with money. True wealth is peace of mind. It is waking up in the morning and knowing that the people in your home are not plotting your downfall. It is knowing that your success is your own, built on sleepless nights, relentless drive, and an unwavering refusal to accept the limitations others try to force upon you. It is the absolute security of knowing that no one can ever take your power away because you did not borrow it from them in the first place. When Maya grows up, she will never know the feeling of having to earn her mother's love. She will never be forced to sit in a kitchen while her parents entertain people who do not matter. She will be taught how to read a balance sheet, yes, but more importantly, she will be taught how to read people. She will know that her voice has value, that her boundaries are sacred, and that respect is something you demand, not something you beg for. I spent my entire youth shrinking myself to fit into a space that was never meant for me. I allowed people who shared my DNA to treat me like a liability. But the greatest lesson I learned from Marcus and Valerie Vance is that toxicity does not get a free pass just because it shares your last name. You do not owe your loyalty to people who only view you as a resource. You owe your loyalty to yourself. They told me I was an embarrassment. They told me I was a failure. They told me I was nothing. So I bought the ground they walked on and evicted them from it. I looked back at the hallway where Julian had disappeared with our daughter, hearing his low, soothing voice singing her a lullaby. Cooper settled at my feet, resting his heavy chin across my slippers. I smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that had taken a lifetime to earn. Family is not blood. Family is who protects you. Fade to black.